Odyssey, 2026, represents one of the most ambitious cinematic interpretations of ancient mythology, bringing Homer's legendary Greek epic to the screen under the direction of Christopher Nolan. Known for films that combine large-scale spectacle with complex storytelling, philosophical ideas, and intense human drama, Nolan approaches the Odyssey as more than a traditional fantasy adventure. The film centers on Odysseus, the legendary king of Ithaca, and follows his extraordinary struggle to return home after the Trojan War. Along the way, he encounters mythical creatures, supernatural forces, dangerous environments, and psychological challenges that test his courage, intelligence, loyalty, and identity. At the heart of the film is a simple but powerful idea. After years of war, Odysseus wants nothing more than to return to his home and reunite with his wife, Penelope. However, the journey that should have taken him home becomes an epic struggle lasting years. His voyage transforms into a battle against both external dangers and internal weaknesses. This makes the Odyssey particularly suitable for Nolan's filmmaking style because the story naturally combines spectacle with questions about time, memory, fate, identity, sacrifice, and human perseverance. The film was written and directed by Christopher Nolan, who also produced it alongside his wife and longtime producing partner Emma Thomas. Nolan's involvement immediately gave the project enormous attention because his filmmaking career had become closely associated with ambitious original concepts, historical dramas, psychological stories, and large-scale cinematic experiences. Instead of treating Homer's ancient poem simply as a fantasy adventure, Nolan reportedly sought to create a realistic interpretation of Greek mythology. This approach became one of the defining characteristics of the production. The story of Odysseus. At the center of the Odyssey is Odysseus, portrayed by Matt Damon. Odysseus is not simply presented as a warrior. He is a king, husband, father, strategist, and survivor. His intelligence is often as important as his physical strength. The Trojan War has already demonstrated his ability to think strategically, but his greatest challenge begins after the war ends. Odysseus wants to return to Ithaca, where his wife Penelope waits for him. The problem is that the sea between Troy and Ithaca becomes the setting for an extraordinary sequence of adventures. Instead of traveling directly home, Odysseus and his men are repeatedly pushed off course. The basic journey creates an important contrast. The Trojan War represents a struggle to win glory, while the voyage home represents a struggle to recover peace. During the war, Odysseus fights for honor, victory, and survival. After the war, he fights for something much more personal, his family and his home. That distinction gives the story emotional depth. Odysseus has already achieved the kind of military glory that Greek heroes traditionally seek. Yet none of that glory can replace his desire to return home. His journey therefore becomes a test of what truly matters. A realistic interpretation of Greek mythology. One of the most interesting elements of Nolan's approach is his decision to interpret Greek mythology through a maximally realistic cinematic style. Rather than presenting the mythological world as a brightly colored fantasy universe where supernatural events simply happen without explanation, the film attempts to make the ancient world feel physically real. This approach is particularly significant because the Odyssey contains some of the most famous mythical episodes in Western literature. Odysseus encounters the Cyclops, the Sirens, the witch Circe, the dangerous waters of Scylla and Charybdis, and various supernatural forces. For a filmmaker like Nolan, the challenge is not merely showing these elements. The challenge is convincing the audience that these extraordinary events belong to the physical world of the movie. Nolan's interest in realism allows mythology to become more frightening and mysterious. If a mythical creature looks completely artificial, the audience may immediately recognize it as an effect. But if the creature appears to exist within a tangible environment, the experience can become more immersive. This is where the influence of classic filmmaking becomes important. Nolan reportedly studied films such as Andrei Rublev and Ran, both of which demonstrate how historical environments can be presented with physical authenticity and enormous visual power. The influence of Ray Harryhausen is also important because Harryhausen was one of the legendary pioneers of stop-motion special effects. His work demonstrated that creatures from mythology could be brought to life through practical visual techniques and imaginative craftsmanship. Nolan's approach therefore connects different generations of filmmaking. The Odyssey combines the ancient world of Homer with the tradition of practical cinematic effects and modern large-format filmmaking. Christopher Nolan's connection to the material. The Odyssey is particularly fascinating because Nolan's filmmaking style has always been attracted to ideas that involve time, memory, perception, and human endurance. In many of his movies, characters struggle against forces larger than themselves. Sometimes those forces are scientific, sometimes political, sometimes psychological, and sometimes historical. The Odyssey provides Nolan with an almost perfect mythological framework for these interests. Odysseus is constantly confronted with forces beyond his control. He cannot control the weather. He cannot control the gods. He cannot control the sea. He cannot predict every enemy. He cannot simply choose the shortest route home. This creates a conflict between human determination and an uncontrollable universe. Odysseus can make decisions, but he cannot determine their consequences. That is a theme that fits naturally into Nolan's cinema. The film also gives Nolan an opportunity to explore the relationship between time and memory. Odysseus spends years away from Ithaca. During that time, the world changes, people change, and Odysseus himself changes. Home is therefore not simply a geographical destination. It becomes an idea. Odysseus is trying to return to the person he was before the war, but his experiences may make that impossible. The longer he remains away, the more difficult it becomes to imagine what returning home will actually mean. The ensemble cast. The film features an unusually large ensemble cast, with Matt Damon in the central role of Odysseus and Anne Hathaway portraying Penelope. Damon's casting is particularly important because Odysseus requires an actor who can communicate physical exhaustion, intelligence, authority, vulnerability, and emotional restraint. The character has to be believable as a warrior and king while also remaining emotionally understandable as a husband desperate to return home. Odysseus is not simply heroic because he defeats enemies. His heroism comes from his determination to continue despite repeated failures. And Hathaway's Penelope provides the emotional counterpoint to Odysseus's journey. While Odysseus travels through distant lands and faces physical danger, Penelope remains connected to Ithaca and the life he left behind. Her character represents waiting, loyalty, uncertainty, and endurance. The story therefore operates on two journeys. Odysseus travels across the sea. Penelope endures the passage of time. These two experiences eventually converge when Odysseus attempts to return to the world he left behind. The ensemble also includes Tom Holland, Robert Pattinson, Lupita Nyong'o, Samantha Morton, Zendaya, and Charlize Theron. With such a large group of recognizable performers, the movie has the opportunity to give different mythological characters distinct identities and dramatic weight. However, the central emotional structure remains focused on Odysseus and his homecoming. The production and scale. The production of the Odyssey was reportedly enormous, with filming taking place across several countries and environments. Morocco, Greece, Italy, Scotland, Iceland, Western Sahara, and Malta provided locations, while additional work took place at Universal Studios in Los Angeles. This geographical variety is particularly appropriate for the story because Homer's epic moves across radically different environments. Odysseus does not remain in one recognizable landscape. His journey involves islands, oceans, caves, forests, coastlines, ancient settlements, and mysterious territories. Each environment can therefore represent another stage in his psychological and physical transformation. Filming in real locations also supports Nolan's emphasis on physical authenticity. Instead of relying entirely on computer-generated environments, large-scale location photography allows the actors and crew to interact with actual landscapes. This matters especially for a story about the sea. The ocean itself becomes one of the film's most important characters. It separates Odysseus from his home, controls his movement, and constantly threatens his survival. The enormous natural landscapes can make the human characters appear small, emphasizing the central idea that Odysseus is fighting against forces far larger than himself. The $250 million budget. With an estimated budget of $250 million, the Odyssey is positioned as one of the most expensive productions of Nolan's career. A budget of this scale is understandable given the film's requirements. The story demands enormous sets, ships, costumes, practical effects, visual effects, large-scale battles, sea sequences, international locations, and an ensemble cast. However, the most important question is not simply how much the film cost. The more interesting question is what Nolan did with that money. Large budgets can easily produce spectacle without emotional meaning. Nolan's challenge is to ensure that the visual scale remains connected to Odysseus's personal story. A gigantic ocean sequence is impressive, but it becomes meaningful when the audience understands what the ocean represents. A massive battle is exciting, but it becomes emotionally powerful when the audience understands what the characters are fighting for. A mythical monster is frightening, but it becomes memorable when its appearance changes the hero's understanding of himself. The best epic filmmaking uses scale to strengthen character rather than replace character. The IMAX 70mm achievement. One of the most remarkable technical claims associated with the Odyssey is that it became the first feature film shot entirely on IMAX 70mm film cameras. This decision represents an enormous commitment to traditional photographic filmmaking. IMAX 70mm photography is known for its extraordinary image quality and enormous frame size. On a giant cinema screen, this format can create a powerful sense of immersion. For the Odyssey, the format is particularly appropriate because the film's story depends heavily on landscapes and scale. Imagine an ancient ship surrounded by an enormous ocean. Imagine a tiny human figure standing against a vast mountain. Imagine hundreds of soldiers moving across an ancient battlefield. Imagine a mythical creature emerging from darkness. Large-format photography can make these images feel physically overwhelming. Nolan has consistently advocated for theatrical cinema and large-format presentation. His decision to use IMAX technology for the Odyssey continues that philosophy. The format is not merely a technical gimmick. It supports the central theme of the movie, the individual confronting an enormous world. The mythical creatures. The creatures and supernatural encounters are essential to the identity of the Odyssey, however, they also present one of the film's greatest creative challenges. The Cyclops, for example, is one of the most recognizable figures in Greek mythology. Audiences already have expectations about how such a creature should appear. Nolan's realistic interpretation creates the possibility of presenting the Cyclops not as a cartoonish fantasy monster but as something physically terrifying. The same principle applies to the sirens. In mythology, the sirens represent temptation. Their danger is not simply physical. They exploit human desire. This means that the sequence can operate on two levels. On the surface, it is an adventure sequence. Underneath, it is a psychological test. Odysseus must resist something he wants. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout the epic. Odysseus does not survive simply because he is strong. He survives because he learns to recognize danger, control himself, and sometimes accept that intelligence is more valuable than force. The journey as a psychological transformation. Perhaps the most important way to understand the Odyssey is to view it as a transformation story. At the beginning, Odysseus is a powerful king and celebrated warrior. But the sea strips away his advantages. He loses ships. He loses companions. He loses control. He encounters forces that cannot be defeated by military strength. As the journey continues, Odysseus is increasingly forced to rely on intelligence, patience, adaptability, and endurance. This makes his journey fundamentally different from the traditional heroic quest. The goal is not to conquer a kingdom. The goal is to survive long enough to return to one. This creates a fascinating paradox. The more Odysseus travels, the farther he gets from the world of war and glory. And the more he loses, the more clearly he understands what he actually values. The war gave him fame. The journey teaches him humility. Penelope and the meaning of home. Penelope is essential to understanding the emotional meaning of Odysseus's journey. Without Penelope, the story could become simply an adventure about a warrior traveling through mythical landscapes. With Penelope, the story becomes a story about separation. Odysseus wants to return because someone is waiting for him. This gives the journey emotional stakes that audiences can understand even without knowing Greek mythology. Everyone understands the idea of wanting to return home. The meaning of home also changes throughout the story. At first, Ithaca may seem like a destination. Eventually, it becomes a symbol of identity. Odysseus is not simply trying to reach a location. He is trying to recover his place in a family and kingdom that continued without him. That creates an important question. When someone has been away for years and experienced unimaginable events, can they truly return to the person they once were? The film's themes. The Odyssey contains several themes that can resonate with modern audiences. The first is perseverance. Odysseus repeatedly experiences setbacks, yet continues moving forward. The second is loyalty. His desire to reunite with Penelope provides a central emotional motivation. The third is the cost of war. The Trojan War may have ended, but its consequences continue long after the battlefield is gone. The fourth is identity. Odysseus begins as a king and warrior, but his journey forces him to discover who he is without his army, kingdom, and reputation. The fifth is fate versus free will. Greek mythology often presents humans as existing within a universe controlled by gods and destiny. Yet Odysseus continues making choices. This creates a fundamental tension. If fate controls everything, what value does human decision-making have? The Odyssey does not need to provide a simple answer. Instead, the journey itself demonstrates that people may not control what happens to them, but they can still control how they respond. Nolan's visual philosophy. Visually, the film's scale reflects Nolan's broader cinematic philosophy. Nolan often prefers real environments, practical effects, physical sets, large-format cameras, and in-camera experiences whenever possible. This approach is particularly effective for an ancient epic because the world should feel tangible. The audience should be able to believe that the characters really occupied these landscapes. This physicality can also make the mythical sequences more convincing. When everything around a creature looks real, the creature itself can feel more real. The result is a world where mythology does not necessarily feel like an escape from reality. Instead, mythology becomes an extreme version of reality. The theatrical experience. The decision to release the Odyssey in IMAX and other premium large formats reinforces the idea that the movie was designed as a theatrical event. An epic such as this is naturally suited to a large screen. The size of the environment matters. The sound matters. The ocean should feel enormous. Battles should feel overwhelming. Mythological creatures should appear physically imposing. The audience should experience the journey rather than simply watch it. This approach also connects with Nolan's broader belief in cinema as a communal experience. Watching an epic film in a theater is fundamentally different from watching it on a small screen. A giant image can transform landscapes into environments and action sequences into physical experiences. The commercial performance. The film's reported worldwide gross of approximately $697 million makes it a major commercial success and places it among the highest-grossing films of 2026. The financial performance is particularly significant given the film's enormous production cost. An expensive epic must attract audiences on a global scale to justify its investment. The reported success therefore suggests that the combination of Nolan's name, the famous source material, the ensemble cast, and the promise of large-format spectacle created substantial audience interest. The reported premium format pre-sales also demonstrate how the movie was marketed as an event rather than simply another theatrical release. This is important in an era where audiences have access to enormous amounts of entertainment at home. To bring people into theaters, a film increasingly needs to offer an experience that feels worth leaving home for. The Odyssey was designed around exactly that idea. Critical reception. The film's reported widespread critical acclaim, especially for Nolan's direction, suggests that critics responded positively to the way the filmmaker translated ancient mythology into modern cinematic language. The success of an adaptation like the Odyssey depends on balancing two opposing demands. The first is faithfulness. Audiences expect recognizable elements from Homer's epic. The second is reinterpretation. A modern filmmaker cannot simply reproduce an ancient poem word for word and expect it to function as a contemporary blockbuster. Nolan's role is therefore to preserve the emotional and thematic heart of the original story while adapting its storytelling language for modern cinema. This is where the project becomes particularly interesting. Homer's Odyssey has survived for thousands of years because its themes are universal. The monsters may belong to ancient mythology, but the emotional problems are timeless. A man wants to return home. A wife waits for her husband. A family is separated. A warrior discovers that victory does not automatically produce happiness. A major cinematic adaptation directed by Christopher Nolan therefore becomes part of a much larger tradition of reinterpretations. The film can introduce younger audiences to a story that originated in the ancient world while also showing how old myths can continue to evolve. The movie also demonstrates why mythology remains valuable to modern storytelling. Myths are not simply old stories about gods and monsters. They are frameworks for examining human behavior. Odysseus represents intelligence and perseverance. Penelope represents loyalty and endurance. The monsters represent danger and temptation. The ocean represents uncertainty. The journey represents life itself. The homecoming. Ultimately, the Odyssey is not really about traveling across the sea. It is about what happens to a person during the journey. Odysseus begins the story as a powerful king who believes he is returning home after war. But the journey changes him. He loses people. He experiences fear. He encounters temptation. He makes mistakes. He faces consequences. He learns that strength alone is not enough. And eventually, the meaning of home becomes clearer. The most important destination is not necessarily Ithaca. The most important destination is the possibility of becoming whole again. That is what makes the story so enduring. Odysseus's journey may involve gods, monsters, ancient ships, mysterious islands, and supernatural forces, but its emotional foundation is remarkably human. A person leaves home. Years pass. The person changes. The world changes. And eventually, that person tries to return. The question is whether home will still recognize him. Conclusion. The Odyssey, 2026, as described, represents an enormous meeting point between ancient mythology and modern blockbuster filmmaking. Christopher Nolan's involvement transforms the project into more than a straightforward adaptation of Homer's epic. His emphasis on realism, large-format cinematography, practical filmmaking, international locations, and psychological storytelling provides a modern framework for one of the oldest surviving adventure stories. Matt Damon's portrayal of Odysseus places a human figure at the center of an enormous mythological world, while Anne Hathaway's Penelope provides the emotional foundation for the journey. The supporting ensemble expands the world and gives the ancient story the scale expected from a modern epic. The film's reported $250 million budget, extensive international production, use of IMAX 70mm photography, and large-format theatrical presentation all demonstrate the scale of the undertaking. Yet the true importance of the movie does not come from its budget or technical achievements alone. Its greatest strength lies in the timeless idea at the center of Homer's story. Odysseus wants to go home. Everything else follows from that desire. The monsters, storms, mythical beings, battles, islands, and supernatural dangers are obstacles placed between a man and the people he loves. Each encounter strips away another layer of his identity and forces him to confront the limits of his power. By the end, the journey becomes a meditation on survival, loyalty, sacrifice, memory, and identity. That is why the Odyssey continues to matter thousands of years after Homer first told the story. It is not merely the tale of a Greek king sailing across a mythical sea. It is the story of a human being trying to find his way back to the life that gives his existence meaning. The story of the Odyssey, 2026, begins not with Odysseus standing proudly on a battlefield, but with his absence. 20 years have passed since Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, left his homeland to fight in the Trojan War. 10 of those years were spent fighting outside Troy, and another 10 were consumed by the disastrous journey home. For the people of Ithaca, however, those years have created a painful uncertainty. Odysseus has become almost like a ghost. He is alive in the memories of his family, but physically absent from their lives. His wife Penelope has spent 2 decades waiting. His son Telemachus has grown into adulthood without truly knowing his father. His loyal servant Eumaeus continues to believe that Odysseus will return, even though almost everyone else has begun to accept that the king may be dead. But Odysseus's absence has created a political crisis as well as a family crisis. Without a king, Ithaca has become vulnerable to ambitious men who want to control the kingdom. Several suitors have gathered around Penelope, hoping to marry her and effectively claim Odysseus's throne. The most aggressive among them is Antinous, a nobleman whose interest in Penelope is not simply romantic. Antinous wants power. If Penelope agrees to marry him, Odysseus's household could effectively fall under his control. Telemachus, as Odysseus's son and heir, stands directly in his way. This transforms the story from a simple tale of a missing king into a struggle over the future of Ithaca. Ithaca without Odysseus. The opening situation in Ithaca establishes one of the most important themes of the story: what happens to a family and kingdom when its leader disappears? Penelope refuses to accept that Odysseus is dead. Her continued faith is not simply an expression of romantic devotion. It is also an act of resistance. The suitors want her to accept reality on their terms. They want her to stop waiting. They want Telemachus removed, they want Odysseus's household transformed into their own political territory. Penelope's refusal prevents them from achieving this. Telemachus is equally important. He is still relatively inexperienced compared with the men surrounding his family, but he is the legitimate heir. His existence makes it impossible for Antinous to simply take control of Ithaca without opposition. Only a small group continues to believe in Odysseus, Penelope, Telemachus, and the half-blind but deeply loyal servant Eumaeus. Their faith becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. 20 years is an extraordinarily long period of time. A person who leaves for war may be remembered as a hero, but after 2 decades, memories can become stories. People begin asking whether the missing person is really coming back. Penelope therefore exists in a state between hope and despair. She cannot prove that Odysseus is alive. But she also cannot accept that he is dead. The threat of the sea people. Penelope's fear becomes even more serious when she warns Telemachus about murderous people from the sea. This detail introduces the moral concept of Zeus's law concerning hospitality and the relationship between guests and hosts. In the world of the Odyssey, hospitality is not merely good manners. It is sacred. A guest should be protected by a host, and a host should be treated with respect by a guest. The relationship carries moral and religious significance. Penelope's fear therefore suggests that the dangers threatening Ithaca are not simply political. Something has gone deeply wrong with the moral order. She fears that people arriving from the sea may violate the ancient rules that are supposed to protect civilized society. The irony is that the audience eventually discovers that these feared sea people are connected directly to Odysseus and the Greek army. The threat Penelope fears is therefore tied to the very war that took her husband away. Telemachus searches for his father. Rather than simply waiting for answers, Telemachus decides to search for information about Odysseus. He travels with Mentor, who serves as his teacher and bodyguard and was also a friend of Odysseus. This journey is important because Telemachus is beginning his own transformation. He has spent his life defined as Odysseus's son. But now he must become a man capable of making decisions for himself. His journey to Menelaus, king of Sparta, therefore becomes a search for more than information. He is searching for his father. He is also searching for his own identity. Menelaus and Helen are connected directly to the Trojan War. Menelaus's wife Helen was the woman whose departure from Sparta helped trigger the conflict that ultimately brought Odysseus to Troy. Telemachus therefore travels to people who knew his father during the years when Odysseus was absent from Ithaca. Menelaus and Helen cannot give him certainty. They are not able to tell Telemachus whether Odysseus is alive. But they can tell stories. And stories become important because Telemachus has so few personal memories of his father. For Telemachus, Odysseus is partly a legend. He knows his father as a king and warrior, but not necessarily as an ordinary man. The stories from Menelaus and Helen help bring Odysseus closer to reality. At the same time, Antinous discovers that Telemachus has left Ithaca. Instead of being relieved, he becomes more dangerous. Antinous understands that Telemachus is his greatest obstacle. He therefore begins conspiring with the other suitors to murder him. The plan is brutally simple. Kill the heir, then plunder Ithaca. This makes Antinous more than an unwanted suitor. He becomes a political predator attempting to destroy Odysseus's bloodline. The Trojan War and the Wooden Horse. While Ithaca struggles with its own crisis, the story moves backward to explain what happened to Odysseus after he left home. The Trojan War lasted 10 years. For a decade, the Greeks besieged Troy. Odysseus eventually becomes responsible for one of the most famous military deceptions in mythology, the wooden horse. Instead of attempting to defeat Troy through another direct assault, Odysseus develops a strategy based on deception. The Greeks construct an enormous wooden horse and hide soldiers inside it. The plan depends on the Trojans believing that the horse is a gift. Sinon is left behind to convince them that the horse should be brought inside Troy. But the deception comes at a terrible cost. Sinon is killed. His death is important because it establishes one of the central moral questions surrounding Odysseus. The plan succeeds militarily. But does success make the method morally acceptable? The Greeks eventually enter Troy, the gates are opened, and Agamemnon's forces sack the city. Menelaus retrieves Helen, and the Trojan War finally ends. For the Greek warriors, it should be the beginning of their return home. Instead, the end of the war becomes the beginning of another disaster. The Greek fleet separates. Agamemnon and Menelaus return home early. Odysseus and his forces take a slower route. Odysseus's second-in-command, Eurylochus, remains an important figure within the group. But the longer the journey continues, the more unstable the relationship between Odysseus and his men becomes. They have already spent 10 years fighting. They are exhausted. They are far from home. They have witnessed death and destruction. Now they must survive an uncertain voyage through dangerous territory. Their first major catastrophe comes when they search an island for supplies. The Greeks enter a cave and become trapped. Inside is Polyphemus, a cyclops. Polyphemus is not simply a frightening creature. He represents a complete rejection of the normal rules of civilization. He captures the soldiers and begins eating them. The Greeks are suddenly trapped in a situation where conventional military strength is useless. Odysseus therefore relies on intelligence. Rather than overpowering Polyphemus directly, the Greeks blind him and escape. But Odysseus's victory creates another problem. Polyphemus cries out to his father, Poseidon. The sea god now knows who has harmed his son. From this moment forward, Odysseus's journey becomes even more dangerous. Poseidon's anger transforms the sea into an enemy. The crew begins to collapse. The Greeks suffer terrible sea conditions as they continue traveling. Eventually they reach another dangerous region where giant Laestrygonians attack them. Most of Odysseus's men are killed. This is a major turning point. At the beginning of the journey, Odysseus commands an army. Now the army is shrinking. Every encounter removes more people from his command. The survivors eventually rebel, leaving Odysseus with his own ship as they seek refuge with Circe. This rebellion demonstrates how badly Odysseus's leadership has deteriorated. The men no longer automatically trust him. They have seen too many people die. They have been separated from home for too long. They are frightened and exhausted. Then they encounter Circe. Circe is a powerful witch who transforms Odysseus's men into pigs. Once again, Odysseus's strength is not enough. He must negotiate. He persuades Circe to restore his men to human form. But Circe gives him information that is even more frightening. If Odysseus wants to reach Ithaca, he must travel to Hades. The journey home requires him to travel into the realm of the dead. Hades and the prophecy of Tiresias. Hades represents a completely different kind of danger. Odysseus has spent years fighting physical enemies. Now he must confront the dead. There he encounters Tiresias, the prophetic figure who delivers one of the most devastating predictions of the story. By divine will, only Odysseus will return home. For Odysseus, this means that the people traveling with him are effectively doomed. The prophecy transforms every future decision into a moral burden. If he continues, people may die. If he stops, he may never return home. And even if he survives, he may have to return to Ithaca alone. Odysseus also encounters the shade of Sinon. This is particularly painful because Sinon died because of the Trojan horse deception. Sinon reproaches Odysseus. His accusation forces Odysseus to confront the human cost of his strategy. The wooden horse gave the Greeks victory. But Sinon paid for that victory with his life. Even worse, Sinon reveals that Antinous was involved in the treachery surrounding him. He had been manipulated into taking Antinous' place in the Greek army. The political conspiracy in Ithaca therefore has roots that extend all the way back to the Trojan War. Agamemnon's warning. Odysseus also meets the shade of Agamemnon. Agamemnon's story becomes another warning about what awaits a warrior who returns home after a long war. Agamemnon tells Odysseus that his wife, Clytemnestra, murdered him after his return. Her motive was revenge for Agamemnon's sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia to Artemis in exchange for favorable winds. This revelation is deeply important. Agamemnon won the war. He returned home. Yet victory did not save him. His own actions during the war followed him home. This parallels Odysseus' situation. The Trojan War is over, but its moral consequences are not. The dead continue to speak. The living continue to suffer. And the choices made during the war continue influencing what happens years later. The monsters of the sea. After leaving Hades, Odysseus and the remaining crew face an escalating series of supernatural dangers. They must confront Charybdis. They must survive Scylla. They must pass the Sirens. Each encounter becomes a test of knowledge and self-control. Odysseus now has the guidance of Tiresias, but knowing what is going to happen does not necessarily make surviving it easy. In fact, prophecy can make survival more painful. Odysseus knows that certain actions will cause disaster. But he cannot always force his men to obey. This becomes especially important on Thrinacia. The forbidden cattle. Tiresias has warned Odysseus that his men will die if they kill the cattle belonging to the sun god. Odysseus therefore gives his crew a strict warning. They must not touch the cattle. But the crew becomes starving. This is one of the most human moments of the story. The men are not necessarily evil. They are desperate. They are exhausted. They are hungry. And desperation causes them to violate the command. They slaughter some of the sacred cattle. Once again, Odysseus's authority proves insufficient. The crew has repeatedly challenged him throughout the journey, and now their decision leads directly to catastrophe. When they leave the island, Zeus sends a terrible storm. Their ship is destroyed. Everyone dies except Odysseus. The prophecy has come true. Odysseus is left completely alone. The man who once commanded armies now has nobody. Calypso and the Lost Years. Odysseus eventually washes ashore on Ogygia. There he encounters Calypso, a nymph who becomes his lover. She treats him with medicine and gives him lotus flowers that induce amnesia. This detail makes the island psychologically important. Odysseus is not merely trapped physically. He is losing his memories. The greatest thing keeping him alive through all these years has been the desire to return home. But what happens if he forgets home? The journey becomes a battle against forgetting. Calypso keeps him on Ogygia for 7 years. 7 years pass. During this period, Odysseus is separated from Penelope and Telemachus for even longer. His absence has now become almost unimaginable. Yet his longing for his family remains. Eventually, Calypso feels pity for him. She recognizes that Odysseus cannot stop thinking about home. She helps him build a raft. Odysseus then submits himself once again to Poseidon's domain. The sea remains dangerous, but this time Odysseus survives. He finally reaches Ithaca. Odysseus returns to a changed home. Returning home does not immediately mean everything is solved. Odysseus has been gone for 20 years. Ithaca has changed. His son has grown. His wife has spent years under pressure from suitors. His political enemies have become more powerful. And Odysseus himself has become almost unrecognizable. Eumaeus is among the first people to provide him with information. He learns that the suitors have sent bandits to assassinate Telemachus and Mentor. The situation is now urgent. Odysseus acts. Mentor dies. But Odysseus rescues Telemachus and kills the attackers. Instead of immediately revealing his true identity, however, he adopts the name Sinon. This disguise is significant because Sinon is connected directly to the guilt Odysseus has carried from Troy. Odysseus is therefore hiding behind the name of a dead man. Argos recognizes his master. One of the most emotional moments of the story involves Argos, Odysseus's elderly dog. Argos recognizes him. The dog is old and near death. He has waited for Odysseus longer than almost anyone else. Unlike the humans around him, Argos does not need proof. He does not need an explanation. He simply knows his master. After recognizing Odysseus, Argos peacefully dies. The scene symbolizes the emotional cost of Odysseus's absence. The dog waited. Penelope waited. Telemachus waited. Eumaeus waited. But not everyone survived long enough to see the king return. Telemachus discovers the truth. Eventually, Telemachus realizes that the man calling himself Sinon is actually his father. The revelation is important because Telemachus has spent his entire life living under the shadow of an absent father. He has heard stories about Odysseus. The reunion is not simply emotional. It is also complicated. Telemachus has grown up without Odysseus. Odysseus has missed his son's childhood. There is no way to recover those lost years. Their relationship therefore has to be rebuilt. The feast and Antinous. Odysseus then enters a tense feast while remaining disguised. Antinous is present. The man who has spent years attempting to take Penelope and Ithaca for himself is now sitting at the same table as the king he believed dead. Odysseus knows the truth. He knows Antinous' role in the betrayal of Sinon. Antinous does not yet fully understand who stands before him. Odysseus confronts him indirectly. Antinous responds with violence and thrashes him. Penelope intervenes. This moment is important because Odysseus is still choosing restraint. He could reveal himself immediately. He could kill Antinous. He could announce that the king has returned. Instead, he continues to observe. He needs to understand what has happened to Ithaca. He also needs to confront Penelope. Odysseus confesses to Penelope. The most important emotional confrontation comes when Odysseus, still disguised, speaks privately with Penelope. Instead of presenting himself as a triumphant hero, he confesses. He tells Penelope that he feels guilty. The confession is built around the idea of Zeus's law. Odysseus recognizes that the Trojan horse deception violated the sacred relationship between hosts and guests. The Greeks entered Troy through deception. They killed people who did not necessarily deserve to die. Odysseus also admits that he participated in the desecration of Athena's statue after killing her priestess. This is especially important because Athena had assumed the form of the priestess to punish Odysseus through visions. Odysseus's suffering is therefore not random. The visions are connected to guilt. His supernatural experiences become manifestations of his moral failure. The sea people were the Greeks. Odysseus then gives Penelope perhaps the most devastating revelation of all. The people she feared were the murderous people from the sea. They were the Greeks. The very warriors who returned from the Trojan War were responsible for the violence that made Penelope afraid of outsiders. This revelation connects the opening of the story with everything that happened before it. Penelope's fear was not irrational. The danger came from the same culture that celebrated Odysseus as a hero. This creates a complicated image of heroism. Odysseus may have been brilliant. He may have helped win the Trojan War. He may have survived monsters, gods, storms, and the underworld. But he cannot escape responsibility for what he did. He therefore asks Penelope for forgiveness. This is not the triumphant return of an uncomplicated hero. It is the return of a man carrying 20 years of memories, losses, and guilt. Penelope's decision. Penelope responds in a way that leaves Odysseus in an emotionally devastating position. She announces that she is ready to remarry. She tells the suitors to return at dawn. On the surface, this appears to mean that Penelope has finally abandoned her hope. But the deeper significance is much more complicated. For 20 years, Penelope has waited. She has defended Odysseus's household. She has protected Telemachus. She has resisted the suitors. Now Odysseus has returned, but he has not simply returned as the man she remembers. He is carrying guilt. He has experienced supernatural punishment. He has lost almost everyone who traveled with him. He has been away for 2 decades. And he has returned under a false name. Penelope therefore faces a difficult emotional reality. The man she waited for has finally returned, but the question remains whether the marriage and family she remembers can actually be restored. The meaning of Odysseus's return. This section of the Odyssey is fundamentally about the cost of coming home. At first, Odysseus's goal seems simple. Return to Ithaca. Return to Penelope. Return to Telemachus. But the journey demonstrates that returning home is not the same thing as undoing the past. Odysseus cannot bring back the men who died. He cannot undo Sinon's death. He cannot erase the destruction of Troy. He cannot restore the 20 years that Telemachus spent growing up without him. He cannot erase Penelope's loneliness. He cannot undo his violation of sacred laws. He cannot escape the consequences of his choices. The journey therefore transforms Odysseus from a warrior seeking victory into a man seeking forgiveness. That is the true meaning of his return. His greatest enemy is no longer Polyphemus. It is no longer Poseidon. It is no longer Scylla or Charybdis. His greatest enemy is the past. Conclusion. The story of the Odyssey, 2026, transforms the classic idea of a heroic journey into a much darker examination of survival, guilt, family, and responsibility. Odysseus leaves Ithaca as a king and warrior. He spends 10 years fighting at Troy. He uses deception to destroy the city. Then his journey home takes another 10 years. During that time, he loses almost his entire crew, angers Poseidon, encounters Polyphemus, Circe, Hades, Tiresias, Scylla, Charybdis, the Sirens, and Calypso, and eventually becomes completely alone. Meanwhile, Ithaca deteriorates. Penelope waits. Telemachus grows up. Antinous attempts to seize control. And the threat to the kingdom becomes increasingly serious. When Odysseus finally returns, the story refuses to present him as a simple victorious hero. Instead, he returns as a damaged man. He has survived, but survival has come at an enormous price. He has learned that intelligence can save a person but cannot erase guilt. He has learned that winning a war does not mean winning peace. He has learned that reaching home does not automatically restore the life that existed before departure. And most importantly, he has learned that a hero must eventually answer for his actions. The final confrontation with Penelope is therefore more important than any battle with a monster. Odysseus has spent 20 years fighting to reach Ithaca. Now he must discover whether Ithaca can accept him. He must face his wife. He must face his son. He must face the political enemies who tried to replace him. But above all, he must face himself. The Odyssey is therefore not simply the story of a king who returns after 20 years. It is the story of a man who discovers that the hardest part of the journey is not getting home. It is becoming worthy of home again. Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey, 2026, is built around one of the most famous stories in ancient literature, but the enormous cast is what allows the film to transform Homer's epic into a large-scale cinematic world. The story is not simply about Odysseus traveling across the sea. It is about an entire network of relationships involving kings, queens, warriors, gods, monsters, servants, enemies, family members, and supernatural figures. Every major character represents a different part of Odysseus's journey. Some characters help him survive. Others challenge his decisions. Some remind him of his responsibilities. Others represent the consequences of his actions. At the center of this enormous ensemble is Matt Damon as Odysseus, but the importance of the film's cast comes from the way each character reflects a different dimension of the legendary king's personality and journey. Matt Damon as Odysseus. Matt Damon plays Odysseus, the legendary king of Ithaca and the central character of the story. Odysseus is fundamentally different from a traditional warrior hero. He is not defined only by physical strength. His greatest weapon is his mind. Christopher Nolan described the character as complicated, an extraordinary strategist and an extremely wily person. This description captures one of the most important aspects of Odysseus. He is intelligent. He is resourceful. He can manipulate situations. He can create elaborate plans. But his intelligence can also become dangerous. The Trojan horse demonstrates his greatest strength and greatest weakness at the same time. His strategy helps the Greeks defeat Troy, but the deception also creates enormous moral consequences. This makes Odysseus a complicated protagonist. The audience can admire his intelligence while questioning his decisions. He can be heroic while simultaneously being responsible for terrible actions. Damon therefore has to portray several versions of the same man. At the beginning, Odysseus is a king and military commander. During the journey, he becomes a survivor. After losing his crew, he becomes a lonely traveler. When he finally reaches Ithaca, he becomes a disguised stranger trying to understand what happened in his absence. The role therefore requires Damon to communicate physical exhaustion, leadership, intelligence, guilt, determination, and emotional vulnerability. Tom Holland as Telemachus. Tom Holland plays Telemachus, the son of Odysseus and Penelope and the Prince of Ithaca. Telemachus is essential because his story develops alongside his father's. When Odysseus leaves for Troy, Telemachus is young. When Odysseus finally returns, Telemachus is a grown man. That means the father misses almost the entire process of his son's childhood. Telemachus grows up hearing stories about a father he barely knows. Odysseus is simultaneously a parent and a legend. This creates an unusual father-son relationship. Telemachus wants to discover what happened to his father, but his search is also an attempt to discover who he is. If Odysseus is a famous warrior and king, what does that make Telemachus? The young prince must eventually become capable of defending Ithaca himself. His journey with Mentor therefore represents a coming-of-age story. Telemachus begins as the son of a legendary hero. He gradually becomes a person capable of standing beside that hero. And Hathaway as Penelope. And Hathaway portrays Penelope, Odysseus's wife and the queen of Ithaca. Penelope is one of the emotional foundations of the story. While Odysseus travels across the world, Penelope remains at home. Her struggle is therefore fundamentally different from his. Odysseus fights monsters, storms, armies, and supernatural forces. Penelope fights time, uncertainty, political pressure, and unwanted suitors. She has to protect her household while everyone around her questions whether Odysseus will ever return. Her refusal to immediately remarry demonstrates extraordinary loyalty, but it also creates political danger. The suitors want Penelope because marriage to the queen could help them claim power. Penelope therefore becomes the center of a political conflict. She must protect her son. She must preserve Odysseus's household. And she must make decisions without knowing whether her husband is alive. Hathaway's performance is consequently important because Penelope cannot simply be portrayed as a passive woman waiting for a man. She is actively managing a dangerous political situation. Robert Pattinson as Antinous. Robert Pattinson plays Antinous, one of Penelope's suitors and one of the primary human antagonists of the story. Unlike mythological monsters, Antinous represents a threat that exists inside Ithaca itself. He wants Penelope. But more importantly, he wants the power associated with her. Odysseus's disappearance creates an opportunity. If Penelope marries Antinous, he can potentially gain control over Ithaca. Telemachus is therefore a major obstacle. Antinous' willingness to conspire against Telemachus reveals how far he is prepared to go. Pattinson reportedly described Antinous as sleazy and compared him to Lester Diamond, the character played by James Woods in Casino. That comparison suggests a character driven by opportunism, selfishness, and questionable morality. Antinous is not interested in honorable courtship. He is interested in winning, and because he believes Odysseus is dead, he thinks the future belongs to him. Lupita Nyong'o as Helen and Clytemnestra. Lupita Nyong'o performs a particularly demanding dual role by portraying two characters, Helen of Troy and Clytemnestra. The connection between the two is especially important because they are twins. Helen is one of the most famous women in Greek mythology. She is associated with extraordinary beauty, and her abduction is connected to the beginning of the Trojan War. Her story is therefore directly connected to Odysseus's military journey. Without the Trojan conflict, Odysseus might never have left Ithaca. Helen therefore represents the distant event that eventually creates the circumstances of Odysseus's 20-year absence. Clytemnestra provides a darker parallel. She is the wife of Agamemnon and eventually murders him after his return from Troy. Her motivation is connected to the sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia. The contrast between the twins is significant. Helen becomes associated with the beginning of the Trojan War. Clytemnestra becomes associated with its aftermath. One woman's story helps trigger a war. The other woman responds to the sacrifices caused by that war. Samantha Morton as Circe. Samantha Morton plays Circe, the powerful witch and goddess living on Aeaea. Circe is one of the most memorable supernatural figures in Odysseus's journey. She initially transforms his men into pigs. This demonstrates that Odysseus has entered a world where ordinary physical strength is no longer enough. He has to negotiate with someone whose power operates differently from military power. After Odysseus persuades Circe to restore his men, she becomes an important source of information. She tells him that reaching Ithaca requires a journey through Oceanus and into Hades. Circe therefore changes the direction of the story. She does not simply function as another obstacle. She becomes a guide who reveals that Odysseus's journey is going to become even more dangerous. John Leguizamo as Eumaeus. John Leguizamo portrays Eumaeus, Odysseus's loyal servant and swineherd. Eumaeus represents loyalty in its purest form. While many people begin to doubt that Odysseus will ever return, Eumaeus continues believing. He has spent years waiting for his king. His loyalty is especially important because Odysseus eventually returns to Ithaca disguised as someone else. Eumaeus becomes one of the people who helps the returning king understand what happened during his absence. The character also helps connect Odysseus to ordinary life. Odysseus may be a king, but Eumaeus remembers the man behind the title. Zendaya as Athena. Zendaya plays Athena, the goddess of wisdom, warfare, and handicraft. Athena has a particularly important relationship with Odysseus. She represents intelligence and strategic thinking, qualities that define Odysseus himself. This makes Athena almost like a supernatural reflection of his personality. Odysseus survives because he thinks. Athena represents the divine version of that intelligence. However, Zendaya's role becomes even more complicated because she also portrays the young Trojan priestess of Athena. That priestess is killed during the sack of Troy. Later, Athena assumes the priestess's form. This gives the goddess a direct connection to Odysseus's guilt. Odysseus believes he is simply a victorious warrior. Athena forces him to see the human consequences of his actions. The goddess therefore becomes both protector and moral judge. Charlize Theron as Calypso. Charlize Theron plays Calypso, the nymph of Ogygia. Calypso offers Odysseus something he desperately needs, a place where his suffering can stop. After years of war, monsters, storms, death, and isolation, Ogygia offers temporary peace. But there is a price. Calypso wants Odysseus to remain with her as her husband and promises him immortality. This creates one of the most important temptations in Odysseus's journey. He could escape aging. He could escape ordinary human suffering. He could remain with a supernatural being. But he would have to abandon Ithaca. His decision demonstrates that his love for Penelope and his desire to return home are stronger than the promise of eternal life. Jon Bernthal as Menelaus. Jon Bernthal plays Menelaus, king of Sparta and husband of Helen. Menelaus is directly connected to the origins of the Trojan War. His relationship with Helen makes him one of the central figures in the conflict that forced Odysseus away from Ithaca. When Telemachus visits Sparta, Menelaus becomes a source of information about Odysseus. However, he cannot provide certainty. He can tell stories. He can remember the warrior. But he cannot tell Telemachus whether his father is alive. Himesh Patel as Eurylochus. Himesh Patel portrays Eurylochus, Odysseus's second-in-command. Eurylochus serves an important dramatic purpose because he challenges Odysseus. This prevents Odysseus from becoming an unquestioned leader. A leader surrounded only by people who agree with him is dramatically less interesting. Eurylochus forces Odysseus to defend his choices. Their disagreements reveal the pressure building within the crew. The longer the voyage continues, the more difficult it becomes for Odysseus to maintain authority. Bill Irwin as Polyphemus. Bill Irwin performs the on-set role of Polyphemus, the Cyclops and son of Poseidon. Polyphemus is one of the most physically intimidating enemies Odysseus encounters. He represents raw physical power. Odysseus cannot defeat him through conventional combat. Instead, he uses strategy. The Greeks blind Polyphemus and escape. But the victory has catastrophic consequences because Polyphemus calls upon his father Poseidon. The encounter therefore demonstrates one of the central principles of the story. Odysseus can win a battle and still lose the larger war. Elliot Page as Sinon. Elliot Page plays Sinon, a Greek soldier whose story adds an important moral dimension to the film. Sinon is particularly interesting because he is not part of Homer's original Odyssey in this form. His story draws from later mythology and Virgil's Aeneid. In this interpretation, Sinon is the son of one of Antinous' slaves and was recruited as a child to become a soldier. His connection to Antinous makes him especially important. Sinon becomes a person caught between powerful men. He does not control the larger political and military forces surrounding him. Yet he pays the ultimate price. The Trojan horse strategy results in his death. Later, Odysseus encounters Sinon's shade in the underworld. This gives Sinon an unusual role. Even after death, he remains part of Odysseus's conscience. Benny Safdie as Agamemnon. Benny Safdie plays Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae and commander of the Greek forces. Agamemnon represents military authority. He is one of the most powerful Greek kings and one of the central figures of the Trojan War. But his story demonstrates that power and victory do not guarantee happiness. After returning from Troy, Agamemnon is murdered by Clytemnestra. His fate becomes a warning to Odysseus. A hero can survive war and still die at home. A king can conquer a city and still lose his own family. The other suitors. Several additional actors portray Penelope's suitors. Corey Hawkins plays Polybus. Nico Nicotera portrays Peisander. Elise Gable plays Elatus. Ido Goldberg portrays Amphimedon. Jamie Harris plays Agilus. Together, these men create the political pressure surrounding Penelope. Their importance is not necessarily that every individual suitor is equally complex. The suitors therefore function almost like a political machine attempting to replace the old royal order. Mia Goth and Logan Marshall Green as Melantho and Melanthius. Mia Goth portrays Melantho, while Logan Marshall Green plays Melanthius. They are twin siblings connected to Odysseus's household. Melantho is portrayed as a disloyal maidservant. Melanthius is an dishonest cowherd. Their characters demonstrate that the threat to Odysseus's household does not come only from outsiders. Some of the people inside his own household have become disloyal. This makes Odysseus's return particularly complicated. He cannot simply walk into Ithaca and assume everyone will welcome him. Ryan Hurst as Mentor. Ryan Hurst plays Mentor, the guide and teacher of Telemachus. Mentor has a relationship with Odysseus and becomes an important influence on his son. He helps Telemachus navigate a world in which he is expected to become a leader despite having grown up without his father. Mentor therefore represents education and preparation. He is helping Telemachus become the person he needs to be. James Remar as Tiresias. James Remar portrays Tiresias, the blind prophet of the Greek underworld. Tiresias is one of the most important figures in Odysseus's journey because he provides information about the future. His prophecy tells Odysseus that only he will return home. That prediction changes how the audience understands the rest of the journey. Every crew member who dies becomes part of the prophecy. Tiresias also warns Odysseus about the dangers ahead. Yet prophecy does not remove free will. Odysseus and his men still have to make choices. The prophecy simply makes the consequences more terrifying. Odysseus's crew. The film also features a large group of actors portraying Odysseus's crew. Will Yoon Lee plays Anchialus. Jimmy Gonzalez plays Cephus. Andrew Howard portrays Polites. Jovan Adepo plays Elpenor. Jesse Garcia portrays Menitus. Josh Stewart plays Antiphates. Sean Avery portrays Laodamas. Anthony Molinari plays Perimedes. Stephen Murphy portrays Phemius. Ian Castleberry plays Dolios. These characters help make Odysseus's journey feel like the journey of an actual group of people rather than one hero traveling alone. Their presence is important because the deaths of Odysseus's men become progressively more tragic. At the beginning, there are many. By the end, Odysseus is alone. Every crew member represents another person lost because of the war, the journey, the gods, the monsters, or human mistakes. The crew also gives Odysseus's leadership dramatic weight. A leader cannot simply be judged by whether he survives. He must also be judged by what happens to the people following him. Travis Scott as the Bard. Travis Scott makes a cameo as a bard. His inclusion is particularly interesting because it connects the ancient tradition of oral storytelling with modern music. The Odyssey itself survived through centuries of retelling. Before written versions became dominant, stories were transmitted through oral poetry. Bards preserved history, mythology, and cultural memory through performance. Nolan's decision to cast a rapper in this role creates a modern parallel. A rapper also tells stories through rhythm, performance, language, and memory. The cameo therefore works on a conceptual level. It reminds the audience that the Odyssey is not simply a story from the ancient world. It is a story that has continually been retold. Every generation changes how the story is performed. The Trojan characters. Rafi Gavron and Shiloh Fernandez appear briefly as Trojans involved in Sinon's death and the encounter with the Trojan horse. Their roles help establish the danger surrounding the deception. The Trojan horse may eventually become one of the most famous symbols of Odysseus's intelligence, but the presence of characters connected to Sinon's death reminds the audience that deception has consequences. The Greek victory is therefore not presented as a completely clean heroic achievement. Eurycleia. Kate Fugler portrays Eurycleia, a loyal slave and nurse connected to Odysseus and Penelope. Characters such as Eurycleia are important because they represent continuity. She has remained connected to the household throughout Odysseus's absence. She belongs to the world that existed before the Trojan War and survives into the world after it. Her loyalty also helps reinforce the idea that Odysseus's household has not completely forgotten him. The steward of Menelaus. Maurice Comte plays Menelaus's steward. Although this is a smaller role, the character helps establish the world surrounding Menelaus and Helen. Large historical stories often depend on such supporting figures because they make royal environments feel populated and functional rather than empty. Telemachus as helmsman. Nick E. Tarabay portrays the unnamed helmsman of Telemachus's ship. The helmsman represents another practical part of the journey. Telemachus may be a prince, but he still requires people with experience to help him travel. His journey is therefore not simply a personal adventure. It is also a physical expedition through a dangerous world. The bandit disguised as a priest. Michael Vlamis plays a bandit disguised as a priest who attacks Telemachus in Pylos. This character demonstrates the danger surrounding Telemachus. Antinous' conspiracy is not an abstract threat. It creates real violence. The fact that a bandit disguises himself as a religious figure also reinforces one of the film's recurring themes: appearances can be deceptive. Odysseus uses disguises. His enemies use disguises. People are repeatedly forced to question what is real and what is false. Iris. Brian Vernal plays Iris, a beggar in Ithaca. Iris occupies a smaller role but contributes to the atmosphere of Odysseus's return. Ithaca is not exactly the kingdom Odysseus left 20 years earlier. The social world has changed. There are new people. New power structures exist. The returning king therefore has to navigate an environment that has become unfamiliar. Why the ensemble matters. The enormous cast of the Odyssey is not simply an attempt to create a spectacular blockbuster. Each group represents a different part of the story. Odysseus represents the journey. Penelope represents home. Telemachus represents the next generation. Antinous represents political corruption. Athena represents divine wisdom. Poseidon represents divine anger. Circe represents supernatural knowledge and transformation. Calypso represents temptation and escape. Tiresias represents prophecy. Polyphemus represents physical danger. Agamemnon represents the consequences of war. Helen represents the origins of the conflict. Clytemnestra represents revenge and the destruction left behind by war. Eumaeus represents loyalty. Eurylochus represents disagreement and doubt. Sinon represents guilt. Together, these characters create a much larger portrait of Odysseus. The story becomes a series of mirrors. Every character reveals something about him. Athena reflects his intelligence. Eurylochus challenges his leadership. Polyphemus tests his strategy. Poseidon represents the consequences of his actions. Calypso tests his loyalty. Tiresias reveals his fate. Sinon represents his guilt. Penelope represents what he is fighting to recover. Telemachus represents what he has lost while he was away. The character structure therefore makes the film's central theme much deeper. Odysseus is not simply traveling through different locations. He is traveling through different aspects of himself. Conclusion. The cast of the Odyssey, 2026, creates an enormous dramatic ecosystem around Matt Damon's Odysseus. At the center is a complicated hero who is brilliant enough to defeat enemies through strategy but flawed enough to create disasters through his own decisions. Around him are characters who represent different dimensions of his life. Telemachus is the son he lost 20 years with. Penelope is the wife he has spent decades trying to return to. Antinous is the political enemy who threatens everything he left behind. Athena represents wisdom and divine protection but also forces Odysseus to confront his moral failures. Polyphemus and Poseidon demonstrate the consequences of his actions. Circe and Calypso represent supernatural temptation and transformation. Tiresias reveals the terrible cost of his journey. Agamemnon reminds him that surviving war does not guarantee a happy return. Sinon becomes the voice of guilt from the past. Eumaeus represents the loyalty that survived his absence. Even the smaller characters have a purpose because they help construct a world in which Odysseus's journey feels populated, dangerous, and emotionally consequential. Most importantly, the ensemble allows the Odyssey to explore a question that is much bigger than whether Odysseus will reach Ithaca. The real question is what kind of man will reach it. When Odysseus left home, he was a king, warrior, husband, and father. 20 years later, he returns as a survivor carrying memories of war, death, deception, loss, divine punishment, and guilt. Every major character he encounters has contributed to that transformation. That is why the casting of the Odyssey is so important. The actors are not simply filling roles in an ancient adventure. They are creating the human and mythological forces that shape Odysseus's identity. And when he finally stands before Penelope and Telemachus, the audience is not simply seeing a king return to his kingdom. The development of the Odyssey, 2026, began long before audiences knew that Christopher Nolan was preparing to bring Homer's ancient Greek epic to the big screen. After the enormous success of Oppenheimer, 2023, Nolan found himself in an unusual position. He had just completed one of the most demanding films of his career, had received extraordinary critical attention, and had reached a new level of recognition within the film industry. Yet one question remained. What would Christopher Nolan make next? For a filmmaker whose projects often take years to develop and are usually built around ambitious ideas, choosing the next film is not a simple matter. Nolan does not appear to approach filmmaking as a process of simply selecting another available property. He wants to become deeply connected to the material. By November 2023, Nolan had not decided what his next movie would be. That uncertainty is important because Oppenheimer had placed Nolan at an unusual creative crossroads. The film had been a major critical and commercial achievement, and its success gave him the freedom to consider a wide range of possibilities. But freedom can create its own challenge. When a filmmaker has the opportunity to make almost anything, the question becomes what is actually worth making. Nolan's search for the next story. After Oppenheimer, Nolan was receptive to different ideas for his next project. However, he felt that he would need to own it completely. That idea is crucial to understanding how the Odyssey eventually emerged. For Nolan, the next project could not simply be something that sounded impressive. It had to be a story he could personally commit to. It had to be something he could shape according to his own filmmaking philosophy. It had to justify the enormous amount of time, money, energy, and creative attention required to produce one of his large-scale films. This is particularly relevant because Nolan's movies frequently demand unusual levels of preparation. His films often involve complicated structures, large-scale action, practical effects, historical research, specialized cinematography, enormous sets, and difficult locations. Therefore, choosing the right story is the first major part of the production. The story has to be large enough to justify the scale. But it also has to be emotionally powerful enough to sustain the audience through that scale. Oppenheimer's success changes the situation. The turning point came in March 2024. Oppenheimer won several Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. These awards were significant for Nolan not simply because they recognized his previous work but because they demonstrated how far his career had evolved. For years, Nolan had been known as a filmmaker capable of combining ambitious ideas with blockbuster entertainment. Oppenheimer showed that he could take an intensely serious historical subject and turn it into a major theatrical event. The film's success created an unusual level of creative freedom for Nolan and Emma Thomas. Thomas had been Nolan's producing partner for many years, and the two had worked together across numerous projects. After the success of Oppenheimer, they had an opportunity to ask a much larger question. What should their next major cinematic experience be? The answer would eventually become the Odyssey. Nolan begins writing. Shortly after the award's success, Nolan began writing the screenplay. This was the beginning of the project's transformation from an idea into a film. However, the development process was not immediately public. In May, Emma Thomas indicated that the practical details of the production had not yet been fully worked out. This is significant because writing a huge film and physically producing it are two completely different challenges. A story can exist on paper without anyone knowing exactly how it will be filmed. The Odyssey presented enormous practical questions. How could the ancient Greek world be recreated? How could the ocean journey be filmed? How could mythical creatures be presented realistically? How many countries would be needed for locations? What kind of ships, costumes, sets, and practical effects would be required? How could the story's supernatural elements be brought into a physically believable world? These questions would eventually shape the production. Universal Pictures becomes the home. By October, it became known that Nolan was developing his next movie at Universal Pictures. This was significant because Universal had previously distributed Oppenheimer. The relationship between Nolan and Universal had therefore already proven successful. Oppenheimer had demonstrated that Universal was willing to support Nolan's ambitious filmmaking approach. But the Odyssey was different from Oppenheimer in one major business respect. Oppenheimer had been acquired by Universal through an auction. The Odyssey was established directly at the studio. That meant Universal committed to the project from the beginning. The studio also announced a specific release date: July 17, 2026. Giving such a large production a fixed release date well in advance demonstrates the confidence surrounding the project. The production would begin filming in early 2025, creating a relatively clear schedule from development to theatrical release. Nolan and Emma Thomas would again produce the film through their production company, Syncope. The mystery around the project. Perhaps the most fascinating part of the development was how little information Nolan and Universal initially revealed. Nolan has become famous for protecting the secrets surrounding his films. But this secrecy created an unexpected consequence. When filmmakers do not tell audiences what a movie is about, audiences start inventing explanations themselves. That is exactly what happened. The absence of a public logline created enormous speculation. People began trying to determine what Nolan could possibly be preparing. And because Nolan had already made films involving dreams, memory, time, war, science, superheroes, crime, and historical drama, the possibilities seemed almost unlimited. The vampire rumor. One rumor suggested that Nolan's next film might be a vampire period piece. This speculation was interesting because a historical vampire film could potentially fit Nolan's visual and atmospheric approach. A Nolan vampire movie could theoretically combine horror, history, psychological tension, and large-scale filmmaking. But the rumor was incorrect. Nolan was not making a vampire film. The Blue Thunder rumor. Another rumor suggested that Nolan might reboot Blue Thunder, the 1983 helicopter action thriller. This possibility was particularly interesting because Nolan has experience with large-scale action. A modern Nolan interpretation of a helicopter thriller could have involved aerial cinematography, military technology, political intrigue, and practical effects. But once again, the rumor was wrong. Nolan was not preparing a Blue Thunder remake. The Prisoner rumor. Another possibility involved The Prisoner, the British television series from 1967 to 68. This rumor had a little more historical basis because Nolan had previously been attached to a film adaptation of The Prisoner in 2009. Therefore, it was not completely unreasonable for people to speculate that he might return to the project. But that theory was also incorrect. The secrecy surrounding Nolan's project had created a strange situation. The less he said, the more stories emerged. Nolan's reaction to the rumors. Nolan later acknowledged that there was a disadvantage to never telling people what he was working on. When a filmmaker refuses to reveal details, people fill the information gap. They speculate. They create theories. They repeat rumors. Eventually, speculation becomes a story of its own. But Nolan did not necessarily dislike this. In fact, he found the rumors entertaining. This reveals something interesting about Nolan's relationship with audiences. He understands that anticipation is part of the moviegoing experience. A film does not begin when the lights go down. The audience's relationship with a film can begin months or years earlier. Theories, trailers, posters, interviews, rumors, and speculation all contribute to the anticipation. In the case of the Odyssey, secrecy made the eventual announcement even more powerful. The December 2024 announcement. The mystery ended in December 2024. Universal officially announced the title, The Odyssey. Suddenly, the rumors disappeared. The new Nolan project was not a vampire movie. It was not a helicopter thriller. It was not The Prisoner. It was an adaptation of Homer's Odyssey. The studio described the movie as a mythic action epic that would be filmed around the world. That description immediately communicated the scale of the project. The Odyssey is already one of the foundational works of Western literature. It contains gods, monsters, warriors, kings, queens, mythical islands, supernatural forces, sea voyages, battles, betrayal, romance, and revenge. It is essentially an ancient epic designed for cinematic adaptation. But adapting it successfully is enormously difficult. The challenge is not simply the size of the story. It is the fact that audiences already know many of its most famous elements. The Cyclops. The Sirens. Circe. Calypso. The journey to the underworld. The return to Ithaca. These are not obscure concepts. They are cultural icons. Nolan therefore had to find a way to make a familiar story feel new. Nolan's earlier connection to Greek epic. The choice of the Odyssey was not completely disconnected from Nolan's past. Years earlier, he had been attached to direct Troy, a film based on Homer's Iliad, the epic that precedes the Odyssey chronologically. Troy eventually became the 2004 film directed by Wolfgang Petersen. Nolan's involvement ended before the project reached the screen. Instead, he moved on to Batman Begins. But the experience remained relevant. Nolan later reflected that he had felt somewhat overwhelmed by the scale of Troy. That is understandable. The Iliad and Odyssey are enormous works. They contain large casts, complicated histories, mythological elements, military conflicts, political relationships, and huge geographical spaces. For a filmmaker earlier in his career, adapting such material would have been a daunting challenge. But Nolan believed that the following 2 decades of filmmaking had changed his qualifications. The filmmaker who once felt overwhelmed by an epic like Troy had subsequently directed several increasingly ambitious productions. This experience prepared him for the Odyssey. 20 years of preparation. This is perhaps one of the most important aspects of the project's development. Nolan did not suddenly become capable of making the Odyssey. His previous films gradually trained him for it. Batman Begins taught him how to balance character and spectacle. The Dark Knight expanded his approach to large-scale action and moral conflict. Inception demonstrated his ability to construct complicated narrative structures. The Dark Knight Rises expanded his experience with enormous production logistics. Interstellar required him to combine science, emotion, spectacle, and large-format filmmaking. Dunkirk taught him how to tell a historical survival story through tension and multiple perspectives. Tenet demanded complicated action choreography and a highly unusual relationship with time. Oppenheimer demonstrated his ability to transform a historical figure and complicated political scientific story into a major theatrical event. Each film became another stage of preparation. By the time Nolan approached the Odyssey, he had spent approximately 2 decades learning how to control large productions. That is why he could now approach the ancient epic with greater confidence. From Troy to the Odyssey. The connection between Troy and the Odyssey is particularly fascinating. The Iliad focuses heavily on the Trojan War. The Odyssey begins after that war and follows Odysseus's journey home. The two stories therefore exist within the same mythological universe. The earlier project may have given Nolan an understanding of how difficult it is to translate ancient Greek epic into contemporary cinema. But the Odyssey offered him a different opportunity. Instead of focusing primarily on a massive war, he could focus on a journey. The story could move between radically different environments. It could shift between war, adventure, horror, fantasy, family drama, supernatural mythology, and psychological storytelling. That combination is highly compatible with Nolan's interests. The Odyssey is a travel story, but every location represents a new challenge. Every encounter changes Odysseus. Every mistake has consequences. The journey itself becomes the structure of the movie. The $250 million budget. The Odyssey was expected to become the most expensive movie of Nolan's career, with a net budget estimated at around $250 million. This figure is important because it tells us something about the scale of the filmmaker's ambitions. A $250 million production cannot be approached like a small historical drama. The film requires an enormous number of resources. There are multiple international locations. There are large sets. There are ships. There are armies. There are costumes. There are practical effects. There are supernatural creatures. There are enormous landscapes. There are large-scale action sequences. There is an ensemble cast. And there is the additional challenge of filming for premium large-format presentation. The budget therefore reflects the physical demands of the story. The world of the Odyssey. The Odyssey is not set in one location. The story moves across an enormous mythological geography. Odysseus begins around the world of the Trojan War. He travels across the sea. He encounters islands and strange civilizations. He enters caves. He visits Circe. He travels to Hades. He faces sea monsters. He reaches the island of the sun god. He is eventually trapped on Calypso's island. Finally, he returns to Ithaca. Each location needs its own visual identity. A conventional film might construct many of these environments digitally. Nolan's approach has often favored real locations and physical environments. That makes the Odyssey particularly demanding. The world has to feel ancient. But it also has to feel physically real. Mythology meets realism. The story contains supernatural events, but Nolan's interest in realism creates an unusual creative challenge. How do you make mythology feel real? The answer is not necessarily to remove the supernatural. Instead, the supernatural can be presented as something physically present within an otherwise tangible world. The Cyclops should feel like a creature occupying physical space. The ocean should feel like an actual ocean. The ancient ships should feel like real vessels. The landscape should feel enormous and authentic. The gods and mythical beings should feel as though they belong to the world rather than appearing as artificial digital decorations. This approach allows the audience to take the mythology seriously. The film does not have to explain away the myth. It simply has to make the myth believable within its own universe. Why the Odyssey fits Nolan? At first glance, the Odyssey may appear different from Nolan's previous work. It is an ancient Greek myth. Nolan has made science fiction films, superhero films, war films, crime films, and historical dramas. But beneath the surface, the Odyssey contains many themes that Nolan has repeatedly explored. Time is central to the story. Odysseus spends years away from home. Memory is central. His identity is connected to his memories of Ithaca. Fate is central. Prophecies determine the expectations surrounding his journey. Choice is central. Odysseus constantly makes decisions despite uncertain consequences. Identity is central. He repeatedly disguises himself and changes how others perceive him. Human endurance is central. He survives situations that should destroy him. These themes make the Odyssey surprisingly compatible with Nolan's cinematic interests. The importance of the journey. The Odyssey is fundamentally about movement. But the physical journey is only the outer layer. The inner journey is more important. Odysseus begins as a victorious warrior. He eventually becomes a survivor. He loses his crew. He loses his freedom. He loses years of his life. He faces supernatural punishment. He experiences temptation. He eventually returns home carrying enormous guilt. That transformation gives Nolan the opportunity to create a character-driven epic rather than simply a sequence of action scenes. The monsters and battles become external expressions of a deeper struggle. The real risk. The greatest risk of the Odyssey was not necessarily the budget. The greatest risk was interpretation. Homer's story has survived for thousands of years. That means audiences already have expectations. If Nolan changes too much, viewers may argue that the film has lost the spirit of the original. If he changes too little, the film could feel like a conventional retelling. The challenge is finding the middle ground. The film needs to respect the emotional foundation of Homer's epic while giving it a cinematic language suitable for modern audiences. Nolan's previous work suggests that this balance is precisely the kind of challenge that interests him. The meaning of the project. The Odyssey represents more than another Nolan blockbuster. It represents a filmmaker returning to a challenge he had once considered too large for himself. When Nolan was younger, the world of Homeric epic seemed overwhelming. 20 years later, after directing increasingly complex productions, he felt prepared. That gives the project a certain sense of artistic progression. Nolan's career has gradually moved toward larger stories. The Odyssey is therefore not an unexpected departure. It is a culmination. It brings together his interest in history, mythology, human psychology, large-scale action, practical filmmaking, theatrical presentation, and complicated ideas about time and destiny. Conclusion. The development of the Odyssey, 2026, is a story of patience, secrecy, ambition, and preparation. In late 2023, Christopher Nolan still did not know what his next film would be. After Oppenheimer's extraordinary success in 2024, he and Emma Thomas gained the freedom to consider almost any project. Nolan began writing. Universal Pictures became the studio behind the project. The filmmakers kept the premise secret. Rumors spread. People guessed that Nolan might be making a vampire movie, a Blue Thunder reboot, or an adaptation of The Prisoner. All were wrong. Then, in December 2024, the truth was finally revealed. Nolan was making the Odyssey. The announcement immediately transformed the conversation. The mystery became an ancient epic. The rumors became irrelevant. And Nolan's next challenge became clear. He would attempt to bring one of humanity's oldest stories to the modern cinema screen. The project was especially meaningful because Nolan had previously encountered the world of Homer through his earlier involvement with Troy. At that stage in his career, he believed the scale of such an epic was beyond his experience. But 20 years changed him. He had directed increasingly complex productions. He had learned how to coordinate enormous crews. He had worked with large-format photography. He had filmed in challenging environments. He had developed experience with practical effects and large-scale action. He had learned how to combine spectacle with intimate human stories. And after Oppenheimer, he had reached a point where he could finally take on the sweeping story of the Odyssey. The estimated $250 million budget reflects that ambition. This is not intended to be a small interpretation of Homer's epic. It is designed as an enormous cinematic undertaking. But beneath the money, locations, effects, cast, and spectacle lies the real reason Nolan's choice is so fascinating. The Odyssey is a story about a man who spends years trying to return home. Nolan's career can almost be viewed as a similar journey toward larger and more difficult cinematic challenges. The filmmaker who once thought a Homeric epic might be too much for him eventually became the filmmaker capable of attempting it. And that is what makes the Odyssey such an important project within Nolan's career. It is not simply the next movie after Oppenheimer. It is the culmination of decades of experience. It is a return to an ancient story through modern filmmaking. And it is an attempt to prove that even after thousands of years, one of the oldest journeys in literature can still become something enormous, emotional, mysterious, and cinematic. The making of the Odyssey, 2026, was not simply a matter of assembling a famous cast and placing them inside an ancient Greek setting. Christopher Nolan's adaptation demanded a complete physical reconstruction of a world that existed thousands of years ago. The actors had to embody legendary characters, while the production designers and costume department had to create an environment that felt historically grounded and physically authentic. This approach is especially important because the Odyssey is a story audiences already know. Characters such as Odysseus, Penelope, Telemachus, Athena, Circe, Calypso, and Polyphemus have been represented countless times in art, literature, television, and cinema. Nolan therefore faced a major challenge. How could he make these familiar figures feel fresh while still respecting the ancient world from which they came? The answer involved three major elements: casting, physical preparation, and realism in production design. The casting process began quietly, with Nolan bringing together actors who had already demonstrated that they could work within his demanding filmmaking style. Several performers were previous Nolan collaborators, which created an existing relationship between the director and members of the ensemble. Matt Damon emerges as the central figure. By October 2024, Matt Damon was in discussions to star in the film. He had worked with him on Interstellar and later on Oppenheimer. Their previous collaborations gave Nolan an opportunity to work with an actor whose abilities he already understood. But the Odyssey required something very different from Damon. In Oppenheimer, Damon played Lieutenant General Leslie Groves, a military leader operating within a historical and scientific environment. In the Odyssey, he would have to become Odysseus, a legendary king from the ancient world whose story combines war, mythology, supernatural encounters, adventure, family drama, and psychological suffering. The role would require Damon to portray Odysseus across different stages of his life and journey. He would have to appear as a commanding king and warrior. He would have to become a strategist capable of outsmarting enemies. He would have to look physically exhausted after years of hardship. He would have to portray a man who loses almost everyone around him. And eventually, he would have to become a returning husband and father carrying enormous guilt. This made the casting of Damon especially important. Tom Holland joins the film. Around the same period, Tom Holland was cast. Holland's involvement immediately added another major dimension to the ensemble. Although there were rumors that Holland might be playing Odysseus himself, the eventual casting established him as Telemachus, Odysseus' son. This distinction is important because the relationship between Odysseus and Telemachus is central to the emotional structure of the story. Odysseus spends approximately 20 years away from Ithaca. Telemachus therefore grows up without his father. He knows Odysseus primarily through stories and reputation. For Holland, the role requires him to portray a young man who is trying to establish his own identity while living under the enormous shadow of a legendary father. Telemachus's journey is therefore different from Odysseus's. Odysseus is trying to return home. Telemachus is trying to understand who his father was. Eventually, those two journeys intersect. Anne Hathaway returns to Nolan's world. Anne Hathaway joined the cast in November. Her connection to Nolan goes back to The Dark Knight Rises and Interstellar. For the Odyssey, Hathaway was cast as Penelope, the wife of Odysseus and mother of Telemachus. This role gives Hathaway an entirely different kind of challenge. Penelope is not traveling across the sea. She is trapped in Ithaca, where she must defend her household against the men attempting to replace her husband. She has to deal with uncertainty. She has to protect Telemachus. She has to resist powerful suitors. And she has to decide whether continuing to wait for Odysseus is still possible. Her character therefore represents the other side of Odysseus's journey. While he spends years fighting to get home, she spends years waiting for him to return. Robert Pattinson joins the ensemble. Robert Pattinson also joined the cast in November. Pattinson was already familiar with Nolan's filmmaking approach after appearing in Tenet. His role in the Odyssey would be radically different. He portrays Antinous, one of Penelope's suitors. Antinous is not a mythological monster. He is dangerous because he is a human being with political ambitions. He sees Odysseus's disappearance as an opportunity. He wants Penelope. He wants influence. And he wants the power associated with Ithaca's throne. Pattinson described Antinous as sleazy and compared him to Lester Diamond from Casino. That description suggests a character who is opportunistic, manipulative, and morally compromised. Pattinson was also unusual among the cast because he specifically requested to read the screenplay before agreeing to participate. This detail says something about the secrecy surrounding Nolan's projects. Nolan has traditionally been protective of his scripts. Actors often receive limited information before joining his productions. Pattinson wanted to understand the role and story before committing. The supporting ensemble expands. The cast continued expanding throughout early 2025. Several actors who had previously worked with Nolan joined the production. Benny Safdie, Elliot Page, Himesh Patel, Bill Irwin, Josh Stewart, Anthony Molinari, and James Remar became part of the ensemble. The film also added performers such as John Bernthal, John Leguizamo, Samantha Morton, Jesse Garcia, Will Yoon Lee, Rafi Gavron, Shiloh Fernandez, Mia Goth, Corey Hawkins, Nick E. Tara Bay, Jimmy Gonzalez, Maurice Comte, Michael Vlamis, Ido Goldberg, Ryan Hurst, Jovan Adepo, and Sean Avery. The size of this cast reflects the enormous scope of the story. The Odyssey is not a 2- or 3-character narrative. It involves kings, queens, warriors, servants, gods, supernatural beings, soldiers, sailors, enemies, suitors, prophets, and mythical creatures. Each group contributes to the sense that Odysseus exists within a much larger civilization. The story needs to feel like an entire ancient world rather than a series of isolated scenes. The Cosmo Jarvis casting change. Cosmo Jarvis had initially been cast, but he left the production shortly before filming because of a scheduling conflict. He was replaced by Logan Marshall Green. The replacement process was unusual. Marshall Green had initially self-taped for a part in December. He received a callback offer in January but declined it. 2 months later, when Jarvis departed, Marshall Green was directly offered the role. This demonstrates how quickly casting decisions can change when a massive production approaches filming. Once cameras are about to roll, the filmmakers cannot simply postpone the entire production because one performer becomes unavailable. A replacement must be found quickly. Skeet Ulrich also revealed that he auditioned for a role but was unsuccessful. This illustrates how many actors may have been considered for the enormous collection of characters in the film. Matt Damon is confirmed as Odysseus. Universal officially confirmed Damon as Odysseus in mid-February 2025. This confirmation came shortly before filming began. It also resolved the rumors surrounding Tom Holland. For a period, some speculation suggested Holland might play Odysseus. Instead, Holland was confirmed as Telemachus. The casting made sense dramatically. Damon's age and screen presence allow him to portray an established king and experienced warrior. Holland's younger presence makes him suitable for the role of a prince who is still becoming an adult leader. Matt Damon's physical transformation. Playing Odysseus required more than simply learning dialogue. Damon underwent an extensive training program and changed his diet. The goal was not to become an enormous bodybuilder. Instead, he aimed to become lean but strong. This distinction matters. Odysseus is a warrior, but he is not necessarily defined by massive physical size. His strength comes from a combination of endurance, intelligence, strategy, and experience. Damon reportedly reduced his weight to approximately 167 pounds, or around 76 kilograms. He also stopped consuming gluten as part of his preparation. The physical transformation was designed to make the character believable as a man who spends years traveling through dangerous environments. Odysseus must look capable of fighting. But he must also look like someone who has survived deprivation. A heavily muscular physique might not communicate the same reality. The goal was functional strength. The beard. Another major aspect of Damon's preparation was his beard. He grew a full beard for approximately a year. Nolan reportedly rejected the idea of using artificial facial hair because he wanted to capture the physicality of real hair. This may appear like a small production detail, but it reveals Nolan's larger philosophy. A fake beard can look convincing under normal conditions. But close-up photography, large-format IMAX photography, intense lighting, wind, water, and physical action can expose artificial materials. Real hair moves naturally. It reacts to weather. It becomes wet. It catches light differently. It changes as the actor moves. For a film emphasizing physical realism, these details matter. The beard also helps communicate the passage of time. Odysseus does not remain visually identical throughout his journey. His appearance should reflect what happens to him. The design department. The visual world of the Odyssey required specialists who could translate ancient history into practical cinematic design. Production designer Ruth de Jong and costume designer Ellen Mirojnick returned to work with Nolan after Oppenheimer. Their previous collaboration was significant because they already understood Nolan's preference for physical detail and historical authenticity. The goal was not to create costumes that simply looked ancient. The goal was to create clothing and objects that looked as though people had actually lived in them. Costume design and the texture of history. Mirojnick emphasized tactility. That means the physical sensation and material quality of objects were central to the design. Linen should look like linen. Leather should look like leather. Armor should look heavy. Sandals should look worn. Weapons should appear functional. The costumes should not look like modern clothing designed to resemble ancient clothing. They should feel like objects that belong to a civilization. This is particularly important in a movie filmed with large format cameras. The larger the image, the easier it becomes to see details. A costume that looks convincing in a small photograph might look artificial when projected across an enormous screen. The Mycenaean world. The production developed costumes based around Mycenaean Greece for kings and soldiers. This is important because the Odyssey is often visually associated with generalized ancient Greek imagery. But the production attempted to ground the world in specific historical periods. The costumes of kings needed to communicate authority. The soldiers needed equipment appropriate to their social position. Athena and Calypso required a different visual language. Their clothing could be more draped and supernatural, helping distinguish divine or mythological figures from ordinary humans. The costume department therefore used clothing as storytelling. A character's status, identity, and nature could be communicated through fabric, materials, armor, and silhouette. The Trojan horse. One of the most spectacular physical constructions was the Trojan horse. Ruth de Jong's production design included a model approximately 36 feet, or 11 meters, tall. The horse reportedly weighed around 8,800 pounds. That is an enormous object. It was so large that transporting it required 27 separate crates. Eventually, it was transported toward the seashore. The physical presence of the horse is important because the Trojan horse is not simply a prop. It is one of the most recognizable symbols of the entire story. It represents Odysseus's intelligence. It represents deception. It represents the fall of Troy. And it represents the moral ambiguity of his victory. By physically constructing such a massive object, the filmmakers could allow actors to interact with it rather than simply placing a digital horse into the environment later. This creates a stronger sense of physical reality. Researching the ancient world. The production also faced a major historical challenge. The filmmakers had to research armor, weapons, ships, clothing, architecture, and other details from a period for which archaeological evidence is incomplete. The records from the Bronze Age and the era associated with Homer are fragmented. This means there is no complete instruction manual explaining exactly what every soldier wore or how every ship looked. The filmmakers therefore had to interpret incomplete evidence. Nolan's approach was to look at the oldest depictions of Homeric characters. Those early artistic representations often depict Homeric characters in the visual style of the period in which Homer himself lived. Nolan argued that this provides a strong basis for the film's visual choices. The reasoning is fascinating. Rather than attempting to reconstruct an imagined, pure version of the distant past, the production could ask, how did the earliest audiences understand these characters? What did Homeric heroes look like to the people closest to the tradition? This approach connects the film not only to ancient history but also to the history of storytelling itself. Agamemnon's armor. The costume design also used materials to communicate social hierarchy. Agamemnon, as commander of the Greek forces and king of Mycenae, needed to look more powerful than ordinary soldiers. The costume designers used expensive materials such as blackened bronze, silver, and sulfur to communicate elevated status. This demonstrates an important principle of costume design. A character does not have to announce that he is powerful. The audience should see it. The materials surrounding Agamemnon tell the story. His armor is not merely protective. It is political symbolism. It communicates wealth. It communicates rank. It communicates access to resources. It distinguishes him from ordinary warriors. Creating Polyphemus. The Cyclops Polyphemus represented one of the greatest special effects challenges. Rather than relying solely on a digital creature, the production used a combination of animatronics, puppetry, and an on-set performance by Bill Irwin. This is significant because Polyphemus needs to interact physically with the actors and environment. He must occupy the same space. He must touch objects. He must move. He must appear to have weight. He must create fear without looking like a conventional computer-generated monster. Using multiple techniques allows the filmmakers to combine the advantages of practical effects. Animatronics can create physical movement. Puppetry can provide detailed control. An actor can give the creature performance and physical intention. Together, these techniques can create something more believable than a single method might achieve alone. The influence of Francisco Goya. The visual design of Polyphemus was influenced by Francisco Goya's famous painting Saturn devouring his son. This is a fascinating artistic reference because Goya's image is disturbing not because it looks like a traditional monster illustration. It is disturbing because it looks psychologically horrifying. The creature is associated with primal violence. The human body becomes vulnerable. The act of consuming another person becomes grotesque and terrifying. That emotional quality is appropriate for Polyphemus. The Cyclops is not frightening merely because he has one eye. He is frightening because he consumes Odysseus's men. He transforms a group of warriors into prey. Goya's influence therefore gives the creature a darker psychological identity. The transformation of Odysseus's crew. Another difficult sequence involved Circe transforming Odysseus's men into pigs. The production reportedly used animatronics, puppetry, makeup effects, and stage magic techniques. This combination is particularly appropriate because the transformation needs to feel magical without becoming visually weightless. The audience needs to understand that humans have become animals. But the transformation also needs to have physical consequences. Puppetry can create physical bodies. Animatronics can provide movement. Makeup effects can show changes on actors. Stage magic can help create the illusion of transformation occurring before the audience's eyes. Together, these methods create a sequence that feels like a physical event. The importance of practical effects. Practical effects have a special importance in Nolan's filmmaking. The advantage is not simply nostalgia. Physical objects interact with light. They create shadows. Actors can touch them. Cameras can photograph them from different angles. Dust can move around them. Water can splash against them. Their presence affects the environment. These interactions can make a scene feel more authentic. A digital object can be made incredibly realistic, but the challenge is ensuring that it interacts convincingly with every physical element around it. Practical effects naturally solve some of those problems. If the Trojan horse is physically present, it automatically casts a real shadow. If an animatronic creature moves through a set, it naturally affects the actors around it. If a costume is made from real materials, it naturally responds to movement. Weta Workshop. Weta Workshop provided special effects for the production. The company has extensive experience with large-scale fantasy and practical effects, making it a natural partner for a project that combines mythology with physical filmmaking. The involvement of a specialist effects company allows the production to create complex creatures, props, weapons, costumes, and environments while maintaining physical detail. This is particularly important for a film such as the Odyssey because the mythology demands visual imagination. The production cannot simply make everything historically accurate. It also has to make the mythical world believable. The balance between history and myth. This is ultimately the central challenge of the design department. The Odyssey is neither a purely historical story nor a conventional fantasy. It occupies an unusual space between the two. There are real historical civilizations behind the story. There are real ancient traditions. There are archaeological traces. But there are also gods, monsters, witches, nymphs, prophecies, and supernatural transformations. The production therefore has to establish a realistic foundation before breaking the rules of reality. The more believable the human world becomes, the more powerful the supernatural events can feel. If everything is fantastical, nothing feels extraordinary. But if the audience begins in a world of real-looking ships, worn leather, heavy bronze armor, natural landscapes, and physically believable architecture, then a Cyclops suddenly feels like an intrusion into a recognizable world. That creates a stronger sense of wonder. Conclusion. The casting and design of the Odyssey, 2026, reveal how seriously Christopher Nolan and his collaborators approached the challenge of adapting Homer's epic. Matt Damon was not simply cast as a famous hero. He physically prepared to become Odysseus, training extensively, changing his diet, becoming leaner and stronger, losing weight, and growing a real beard for approximately a year. Tom Holland became Telemachus, providing the younger generation's perspective. And Hathaway became Penelope, the emotional center of Ithaca. Robert Pattinson became Antinous, the political threat within Odysseus's kingdom. And the supporting ensemble filled the world with kings, soldiers, gods, servants, monsters, and mythical figures. But the physical world surrounding them was equally important. Ruth de Jong and Ellen Morojnik worked to create a civilization that felt lived in rather than artificially constructed. Linen, leather, bronze, silver, sandals, weapons, ships, and armor were treated as physical objects with history. Polyphemus was constructed through animatronics, puppetry, and performance. Circe's transformation sequence combined multiple practical techniques. Weta Workshop contributed to the special effects work. All of these decisions point toward the same goal: make mythology feel physically real. That is the central philosophy behind the production. The Odyssey is a story about gods and monsters, but it becomes more convincing when the human world surrounding them feels tangible. The audience should believe in the weight of the armor. They should believe in the roughness of the leather. They should believe that the wooden horse actually exists. They should believe that Polyphemus occupies the same physical world as Odysseus. They should believe that Circe's magic changes the men standing in front of them. And when those physical details are combined with Damon's transformation into Odysseus, the result is intended to be more than an adaptation of an ancient poem. It becomes an attempt to recreate the physical sensation of entering the Homeric world. That is ultimately what makes the production approach so ambitious. The filmmakers are not merely asking audiences to imagine an ancient Greek myth. They are attempting to make audiences feel as though they are standing inside it. The Odyssey, 2026. How Christopher Nolan filmed the epic across the real world. The production of the Odyssey, 2026, was one of the most physically demanding filmmaking projects of Christopher Nolan's career. Instead of constructing the entire world of Homer's epic inside studios or relying heavily on digital environments, Nolan chose to take his cast and crew into real landscapes across several countries. The decision was fundamental to the movie's identity. The Odyssey is a story about an enormous journey. Odysseus leaves the world he knows and spends years traveling through unfamiliar seas, islands, caves, kingdoms, and mythological territories before eventually attempting to return home to Ithaca. For Nolan, that journey could not simply be represented through computer-generated backgrounds. The actors needed to feel the environment around them. The audience needed to see real landscapes. The weather needed to be unpredictable. The ocean needed to look dangerous. The rocks needed to feel physically imposing. And the locations needed to communicate the enormous distances that ancient travelers would have had to cross without modern maps, engines, communication systems, or navigation technology. This philosophy shaped almost every part of the production. A 91-day production. Principal photography officially lasted 91 days, beginning on February 25, 2025, and continuing until August 5. The production was completed 9 days earlier than originally scheduled. Finishing ahead of schedule is an impressive achievement for a film of this scale. The Odyssey was not a conventional studio movie. The production involved a massive cast and crew, complex sets, international travel, difficult landscapes, large-scale action, practical effects, ships, costumes, creatures, and IMAX photography. Every day of shooting therefore required extensive coordination. When filming takes place across multiple countries, scheduling becomes even more complicated. A delay in one location can affect transportation, accommodation, equipment, actors, local crews, weather windows, permits, and the next shooting location. The fact that the production finished ahead of schedule suggests an extraordinary level of preparation. Charlie's Tale. During production, the Odyssey was filmed under the working title Charlie's Tale. Working titles are often used to keep major productions discreet. For a filmmaker such as Nolan, who is famous for protecting information about his projects, a working title can help reduce unwanted attention. The name also makes it harder for people outside the production to immediately recognize what is being filmed. This was particularly useful because the Odyssey involved shooting in real-world locations. When a major production arrives in a village, historical site, beach, or city, secrecy becomes difficult. A working title can prevent crowds and media from immediately connecting the activity to a major Hollywood film. The global scale of production. The production traveled across a remarkable range of countries. Filming primarily took place in Morocco, Western Sahara, Greece, Italy, Iceland, Scotland, and the United States. This list alone reveals how ambitious the film was. Each region could provide a different geographical identity. Morocco could represent ancient cities and dry landscapes. Greece offered direct connections to the world of Homer. Italy provided additional Mediterranean environments and historical architecture. Iceland could provide dramatic, almost alien landscapes. Scotland could provide rugged coastlines and mountainous terrain. Western Sahara could provide enormous barren environments. The United States could provide studio facilities and controlled production environments. Instead of asking one location to represent the entire ancient world, Nolan could use the natural characteristics of different regions to build a much larger cinematic geography. The physicality of the real world. One of Nolan's most important reasons for filming on location was his desire to embrace the physicality of the real world. That phrase explains a great deal about the production. Nolan wanted the actors to experience the environments rather than simply perform against artificial backgrounds. Imagine filming a scene in which Odysseus has spent years traveling through dangerous waters. An actor standing on a studio set with a green screen might understand the scene intellectually. But an actor standing beside an actual ocean, feeling wind and spray, seeing enormous cliffs, and struggling through difficult terrain receives sensory information that cannot easily be simulated. The environment becomes part of the performance. This is especially important for the Odyssey because the difficulty of the journey is part of the story's meaning. Odysseus does not simply travel from one location to another. He struggles to survive. The journey costs him friends. It destroys his crew. It separates him from his family. It tests his leadership. It forces him to confront the consequences of his decisions. Real locations can communicate that hardship naturally. The unmapped world. Nolan was also interested in the idea of an unmapped, uncharted world. Modern audiences live in a completely different geographical reality. Almost every part of the planet can be mapped. We have satellites, GPS, digital maps, instant communication, weather forecasting, navigation systems, airplanes, cars, ships with sophisticated instruments. For Odysseus and the people of his era, none of this existed. The ocean represented genuine uncertainty. A journey across the sea could mean entering a world where the traveler did not know what would happen next. There could be storms, unknown islands, dangerous coastlines, hostile populations, lack of food, lack of fresh water, navigation errors. This makes the physical landscapes particularly important. The audience needs to understand that these environments were not simply beautiful scenery. They were obstacles. A mountain was a barrier. The ocean was a threat. A cave was a potential trap. A storm could become a life-or-death event. The landscape itself was part of the conflict. Weather becomes part of the story. Nolan also embraced changing weather conditions. This is another consequence of shooting on location. A studio can control lighting. A digital environment can be altered. A computer-generated sky can remain exactly the same for every shot. Nature cannot. Clouds move. Wind changes. Sunlight disappears. Rain arrives. Fog develops. Waves become larger. Temperatures fluctuate. For Nolan, this unpredictability could actually strengthen the film. The weather could contribute to the feeling that Odysseus and his crew are traveling through an uncontrollable world. It also makes the production feel less artificial. If the audience sees genuine clouds, natural wind, actual rain, and real sunlight interacting with the actors, the world feels more tangible. Hoyt van Hoytema returns. Cinematographer Hoyt van Hoytema reunited with Nolan for the Odyssey. The collaboration between the two filmmakers had already produced some of Nolan's most visually distinctive films. Their partnership is particularly important because the Odyssey required a cinematographic approach capable of handling enormous landscapes while also capturing intimate human moments. The film needed to show the scale of the sea. But it also needed to capture Odysseus's face. It needed to show armies. But it also needed to show quiet conversations between family members. It needed to photograph mythical creatures. But it also needed to show the textures of clothing and armor. The camera therefore had to be both monumental and intimate. The IMAX challenge. Perhaps the most technologically significant aspect of the production was the decision to shoot the entire movie using IMAX film cameras. This made the Odyssey the first feature film shot entirely with IMAX film cameras. Nolan had been using IMAX film extensively since The Dark Knight in 2008. Over the years, he had become one of the most prominent advocates for large-format film photography. But the Odyssey took that commitment further. Rather than using IMAX for selected sequences, the entire movie was photographed with IMAX film cameras. This was a major technical challenge. IMAX cameras are physically large. They are powerful. They produce enormous images. But they can also be loud and cumbersome. That creates a problem for dialogue scenes. If a camera is loud enough to interfere with the soundtrack, the solution has traditionally been to place the camera inside soundproof housing. But that adds even more size and weight. Developing a new camera. For the Odyssey, Nolan worked with IMAX to develop a lighter and quieter version of the camera. This was particularly important because the movie contained many scenes requiring dialogue and close interaction between actors. A smaller and quieter IMAX camera allowed the filmmakers greater flexibility. The objective was not merely to obtain spectacular landscape shots. The camera needed to work in intimate dramatic scenes as well. This distinction is important. A large format camera is naturally suited to wide landscapes. But the Odyssey also contained scenes where two characters must stand close together and communicate emotionally. If the camera is physically enormous and extremely loud, it becomes difficult to shoot such moments naturally. The improved camera therefore helped expand the possibilities of IMAX photography. Sound blimps. For close-up scenes requiring audible dialogue, the IMAX cameras were sometimes concealed inside large sound blimps. A sound blimp is essentially a protective enclosure designed to reduce the noise produced by the camera. This allows actors to perform normally without the camera mechanism overwhelming the microphones. But there was another challenge. The camera itself could physically obstruct the actor's view. When two performers are looking directly at each other, they need to see each other's eyes. If a giant camera is placed between them, maintaining natural eye contact becomes difficult. The filmmakers therefore developed a system involving mirrors. The mirrors helped actors maintain eye contact even when the camera was positioned between them. This is an excellent example of how the desire for large-format photography can create unexpected production problems. The crew had to invent practical solutions without compromising the performances. Over 2 million feet of film. The scale of photography was extraordinary. More than 2 million feet of IMAX 70mm film was reportedly used during production. That represents approximately 610 kilometers of film. This number illustrates just how much material had to be physically captured, transported, processed, stored, and managed. Digital cinema can record enormous amounts of footage without requiring physical film reels. Film is different. It is a physical medium. It must be loaded. It must be handled carefully. It must be replaced. It must be transported. And every frame has a physical presence. The limitation of the IMAX camera. One of the most difficult aspects of shooting on IMAX film is the limited amount of film that can fit inside the camera. A single IMAX camera can hold only around 3 minutes of film. This creates a unique rhythm on set. Imagine filming a long dramatic scene. The actors are performing. The emotion is building. The dialogue continues. But eventually the camera reaches the end of the reel. The actors must stop. Then the scene resumes. This means that some performances had to be interrupted for technical reasons. Actors working on digital productions can often perform long scenes without stopping because of media limitations. Film introduces a physical boundary. The camera itself determines how long the performance can continue. This makes the process more demanding for both actors and crew. The beginning in Morocco. The first scenes were filmed in late February near Ouarzazate, Morocco. The production used the village of Ait Ben Haddou. The location is visually remarkable and has frequently been associated with historical and epic cinema. For the Odyssey, it was used to represent Troy near the end of the Trojan War. This means the film's opening imagery establishes the story before the main journey begins. The Trojan War provides the historical and emotional background for Odysseus's journey. The audience first encounters him within a world of war and conquest. The film can then transition toward the journey home. This structure is important because the Odyssey is not simply about where Odysseus goes. It is about what happens after war. The consequences of victory become the beginning of another struggle. Troy after the war. The scenes at Ait Ben Haddou were designed to represent Troy during the final stages of the conflict. This creates a visually powerful opening. A city that has endured years of siege is now collapsing. Warriors move through the ruins. Fire illuminates the night. Buildings are damaged. The Greek army is victorious. But the victory contains the seeds of Odysseus's future suffering. The Trojan horse is part of this world. Odysseus has succeeded through deception. The Greeks have won. But the moral consequences of that victory will follow him. Firelight and portable LEDs. During the midnight raid of Troy, cinematographer Hoyt van Hoytema used numerous portable LED lights to reproduce a specific firelight color temperature. This allowed Nolan to film in almost any direction. That may sound like a technical detail, but it has significant implications for visual storytelling. Traditional filmmaking often requires careful control over lighting direction. A scene lit to resemble firelight can become difficult if the camera moves around the actors. The lighting has to continue looking believable from different angles. Portable LEDs allowed the filmmakers to recreate the visual character of firelight while maintaining greater flexibility. This meant the camera could move freely through the action. The actors could move. The environment could be explored. And Nolan did not have to limit the scene to a single predetermined camera direction. Morocco as Troy. Morocco was therefore not simply chosen because it looked ancient. The physical geography and architecture helped create a convincing foundation for Troy. A location like Ait Ben Haddou can communicate age through its actual walls, surfaces, shadows, and irregularities. These details are difficult to replicate perfectly with digital environments. The camera photographs actual materials. The sunlight interacts with real buildings. Dust moves naturally. Actors occupy real spaces. This reinforces the production's larger philosophy of physicality. The production also filmed in Essaouira and Marrakesh. These locations expanded the geographical possibilities available to the filmmakers. The Greek shoot. After Morocco, the production moved to Greece. This was especially meaningful for a film based on an ancient Greek epic. Filming took place in the Messenia region of the Peloponnese from March 10 through March 21. The locations included Pylos, Mathoni Castle, Almiro-Lakos Beach in Yalova, Nestor's Cave near Voidokilia Beach, and an archaeological palace site in Acrocorinth. Each location offered something different. Pylos carries strong associations with ancient Greek mythology. Mathoni Castle provides a powerful historical environment. The beaches offer open coastal landscapes. Nestor's Cave provides a naturally dramatic setting. Acrocorinth offers archaeological and architectural elements that connect the production to the ancient world. The Cyclops location. Nestor's Cave was particularly important because it was used for scenes involving Polyphemus, the Cyclops. This choice illustrates the advantage of real locations. A cave is already mysterious. It contains natural darkness, irregular walls, narrow passages, echoes, uneven ground, shadows. Those characteristics immediately create atmosphere. Instead of building an artificial cave from scratch, the production could place the actors inside a naturally dramatic environment. That contributes to the sense that the Cyclops encounter is taking place somewhere ancient and dangerous. The sea and the myth. The Greek coastline also helped represent one of the most important elements of the Odyssey. The sea. For Odysseus, the sea is simultaneously a route home and an endless threat. It is the only way forward. But it is also the place where he loses his men. Storms can destroy ships. Monsters inhabit the surrounding mythology. Unknown lands appear beyond the horizon. The sea therefore becomes almost a character in the story. Shooting real coastlines helps communicate that. The audience can see the scale. They can see the distance between land and horizon. They can see the movement of the water. They can understand why ancient sailors would have feared such an environment. Greek production support. The production partnered with Phalairo House Productions' NAF subsidiary during the Greek filming. This local collaboration would have been essential for coordinating the practical requirements of an international production. A large Hollywood production cannot simply arrive in a foreign country and begin filming without extensive local organization. It needs permits, locations, crew, transportation, equipment, security, accommodation, local knowledge, government cooperation, archaeological considerations, environmental considerations. The involvement of a local production partner helps integrate the international team with the practical realities of filming in Greece. The production spent approximately 3 weeks filming in Greece. Financial support from Greece. The Greek production also benefited from significant local financial support. The country's Hellenic Film and Audiovisual Center provided funding as part of a broader investment in local and international productions. The production also received a substantial cash rebate. Such incentives are important in international filmmaking because they can influence where major productions choose to shoot. A country that offers attractive production incentives can become more competitive as a filming destination. For Greece, a major Nolan film also offers broader cultural and economic benefits. The production brings international crews. It creates local employment. It uses local services. It brings attention to locations. And it places Greek landscapes and historical environments before a global audience. The importance of location filming. The international location strategy of the Odyssey ultimately serves one major purpose: to make the journey feel real. Odysseus is not supposed to be traveling through a generic fantasy world. He is moving through a world of physical places. The difficulty of the journey comes from distance. It comes from geography. It comes from weather. It comes from the sea. It comes from the unknown. By filming in real locations, Nolan gives the audience a stronger understanding of the physical cost of travel. An ancient Greek sailor could not simply jump from one location to another. Every movement required time, food, water, navigation, physical labor, favorable weather, a functioning ship, a healthy crew. The real environment makes that difficulty visible. The meaning of real weather. Weather becomes particularly important in this context. Modern filmmaking often tries to control weather. But Nolan embraced its unpredictability. This creates an important philosophical connection with Odysseus's world. The ancient Greeks could not control the sea. They could not summon sunlight. They could not stop storms. They could not instantly determine what lay beyond the horizon. Their journey was governed by forces beyond their control. A production that works with real weather recreates some of that uncertainty. A storm arriving on set is no longer merely an inconvenience. It can become part of the visual world. A cloudy sky can change the emotional atmosphere. Strong wind can affect clothing and movement. Rain can alter the physical appearance of the environment. Sunlight can change the colors and shadows. Nature becomes part of the filmmaking process. Conclusion. The principal photography of the Odyssey was designed around the idea that the audience should feel the physical reality of Odysseus's journey. The 91-day shoot began on February 25, 2025, and ended on August 5, finishing ahead of schedule despite the extraordinary complexity of the production. Filming crossed multiple countries and environments, including Morocco, Greece, and other regions chosen for their distinctive landscapes. The production used the working title Charlie's Tale to maintain secrecy. But the most important decision was philosophical rather than logistical. Christopher Nolan wanted to embrace the physicality of the real world. He wanted his actors to stand in real places. He wanted the camera to photograph real landscapes. He wanted weather to behave naturally. He wanted the audience to understand the difficulty of traveling through an unmapped world. That philosophy also shaped the camera technology. The Odyssey became the first feature film shot entirely with IMAX film cameras. More than 2 million feet of 70mm film were used. A new lighter and quieter IMAX camera was developed for the production. Sound blimps were used for dialogue scenes. Mirrors helped actors maintain eye contact when the camera obstructed their view. And because the camera could only hold roughly 3 minutes of film, even long performances had to be interrupted for reloading. These limitations might seem inconvenient, but they are also part of what makes the production unusual. The film was not created in a frictionless digital environment. The physical limitations of the medium became part of the filmmaking process. The opening shoot in Morocco established Troy as a physical, burning, war-torn city. 8 Benhadou provided an ancient-looking environment. Essaouira and Marrakesh expanded the visual world. Portable LEDs allowed firelight to remain convincing while the camera moved through the Trojan raid. Then Greece provided another level of authenticity. The production traveled through the Peloponnese, filming around Pylos, Mathone Castle, Yealova, Voidokilia, Nestor's Cave, and Acrocorinth. The landscapes were not merely backgrounds. They became part of the storytelling. The cave became the home of Polyphemus. The coastline became part of Odysseus's dangerous world. The archaeological environments helped establish the ancient civilization surrounding the characters. Ultimately, the production strategy reflects the central idea of the Odyssey itself. Odysseus's journey is difficult because the world is physical. The sea is real. The weather is unpredictable. Distance matters. The landscape can kill you. A storm can destroy a ship. A cave can become a prison. An unfamiliar coastline can hide danger. And the journey home can take years. By filming in real locations and using physical filmmaking techniques, Nolan attempted to bring those realities into the filmmaking process itself. The result is intended to make the audience feel that Odysseus is not simply moving through a fictional fantasy world. He is crossing an enormous, unpredictable physical world. And when that world is photographed on IMAX film, with real landscapes, real weather, real materials, practical effects, and actors physically present in those environments, the ancient journey can become something modern audiences can experience with extraordinary visual intensity. That is the central achievement of the production approach behind the Odyssey. It does not merely show the journey. It attempts to make the journey feel physically difficult. The production of the Odyssey, 2026, became increasingly ambitious as Christopher Nolan and his crew moved away from the opening locations in Morocco and Greece and began filming the later stages of Odysseus's journey across the Mediterranean and into some of the world's most remote landscapes. This part of the production is particularly fascinating because the locations were not chosen simply because they looked beautiful. Each location represented a different chapter of Odysseus's journey. The filmmakers had to find places that could represent islands from Greek mythology, dangerous seas, the underworld, hostile civilizations, enormous giants, and the mysterious island where Odysseus encounters Calypso. Instead of building these environments entirely inside a computer, Nolan continued his preference for physical locations. The result was a production that moved across Italy, the United States, Scotland, Iceland, Malta, and Western Sahara. The scale of this journey mirrored the story itself. Odysseus is constantly moving. His world changes from island to island. The environment never remains stable. And the production process attempted to recreate that sense of geographical uncertainty. The move to Sicily. By March 27, the production had moved from Greece to Sicily in Italy. The filming took place in the Aegean Islands, particularly on Favignana. Favignana is an island surrounded by the Mediterranean Sea, and its geography made it particularly appropriate for a story centered on ancient sailors and mythical islands. The location was associated with the Goat Island mentioned in Homer's epic. This is important because the Odyssey contains numerous locations that are described through unusual names, landscapes, animals, and geographical characteristics. Rather than recreating such a place inside a studio, Nolan's team could use an actual Mediterranean island. The environment immediately provides natural elements that would otherwise have to be artificially constructed. The sea is real. The wind is real. The rock formations are real. The sunlight is real. The coastline is real. And the actors are physically surrounded by the landscape. That physical presence supports the production's larger goal of making the ancient world feel tangible. Filming under local restrictions. Shooting on islands creates unique logistical and environmental challenges. These regions are not empty production spaces. They are living environments with residents, wildlife, tourism, historic sites, marine ecosystems, and local regulations. As a result, filming in parts of the Aegean Islands was subject to safeguarding restrictions imposed by local authorities. This meant that the filmmakers had to work within limits concerning where and how production activity could take place. For a film as large as the Odyssey, these restrictions would have required careful planning. The crew could not simply bring unlimited equipment into sensitive areas. The production had to consider the impact of vehicles, boats, people, lighting equipment, temporary structures, and other filmmaking activities. The Italian production company Wildside helped service the shoot. This local partnership was important because international productions depend heavily on local expertise. Local production teams understand the geography, regulations, transportation systems, permits, weather patterns, and logistical realities of their regions. the mythical island of Aeolia. After Favignana, the production moved into another particularly important phase. From April 15 through May 15, water-based filming took place throughout the Aeolian Islands. The production used Lipari, Basileuso, and Vulcano. These islands were used for scenes connected with the mythological island of Aeolia. The choice of these locations demonstrates how the production treated geography as part of the story. Aeolia is not simply a place where characters stop for a few minutes. In the Odyssey tradition, it is connected with Aeolus and the mysterious forces controlling the winds. The sea surrounding such a place is therefore important. The landscape should feel isolated. The characters should feel as though they have entered a world separated from ordinary civilization. The Aeolian Islands provide that sense naturally. They are surrounded by water and contain distinctive volcanic landscapes. That combination of ocean and volcanic geography can produce a visual environment that feels both historically plausible and mythological. The sea as a filming environment. Water filming is notoriously difficult. A normal film set provides control. The filmmakers can control lighting. They can control camera position. They can control the environment. The sea does not cooperate. Waves move constantly. Wind changes. Clouds appear. The sun shifts. Boats drift. Water reflects light differently from moment to moment. And equipment must be protected from saltwater. For the Odyssey, these difficulties were embraced. Nolan reportedly described filming at sea as a particularly primal experience. That description is extremely appropriate for the story. Odysseus belongs to a world where the sea is not a highway. It is an unpredictable force. A sailor has to respect it. A storm can destroy an entire crew. A calm sea can suddenly become dangerous. The sea represents both freedom and vulnerability. By filming directly on the water, the production placed the actors inside the same physical environment that defines their characters' lives. The Viking longship. One of the most remarkable practical elements of the maritime filming was the use of the Draken Harald Harfager. It is a modern Viking longship and one of the largest vessels of its type. For the movie, it was used to represent an ancient Greek warship. This decision is particularly interesting because the filmmakers could have created a Greek ship digitally. Instead, they used an actual large wooden vessel. The actors portraying Odysseus's crew could physically stand on it. They could move across the deck. They could handle the equipment. They could feel the movement of the vessel. The ship could interact naturally with the water. And the camera could capture those interactions. The vessel was sailed between filming locations. That meant it was not simply a stationary prop. It actually traveled through the Mediterranean. The physical reality of the ship therefore became part of the production. Why a real ship matters. A ship is a difficult object to fake. The ropes move. The wooden structure vibrates. The water splashes. The wind affects clothing and hair. The horizon shifts. All of these small physical details contribute to realism. Digital effects can reproduce some of these elements, but physical interaction provides them automatically. The actors are not pretending to stand on a moving ship. They are actually standing on one. That difference can influence performance. The Universal Water Tank. By early May, roughly halfway through production, the crew returned to the Universal Studios lot in Los Angeles. There, the production filmed at the Falls Lake Water Tank. This was unusual because the Odyssey was heavily focused on real-world locations. In fact, this was the production's only major set constructed on a studio sound stage. That detail demonstrates how strongly Nolan preferred real environments. The water tank provided something that the ocean could not. Complete control. A water tank allows filmmakers to manipulate conditions that are impossible to predict at sea. They can control camera position. They can control safety. They can adjust lighting. They can repeat complicated movements. They can introduce controlled water effects. This makes the tank particularly useful for scenes where the filmmakers need physical water but also require precision. The production therefore used a combination of approaches. Real seas for authentic geography. A controlled water tank for technically complicated sequences. This balance is important. Practical filmmaking does not mean refusing every form of controlled production. It means using the physical method that best serves the scene. Scotland enters the story. After the water-based filming, production moved to Scotland. In early June, the filmmakers shot at Findlater Castle in Moray. The castle provided a dramatic architectural environment. Ancient stone structures naturally communicate age. The weather can create atmosphere. The cliffs and coastline provide scale. The location can therefore serve both historical and mythological storytelling. A castle like Findlater can feel simultaneously real and legendary. That quality makes it appropriate for the Odyssey. The film's world needs to exist somewhere between history and mythology. Iceland and the underworld. Late June brought another dramatic geographical shift. For approximately 10 days, the production worked in remote regions of Iceland. The filming included areas such as Landeyjahöfn Harbour, Hjörleifshofi Mountain, the Markarfljót River, and the Snæfellsnes Peninsula. Iceland was primarily used for the Greek underworld of Hades. This was an inspired geographical decision. Hades is supposed to feel fundamentally different from the normal world. It is a realm of death. It is separated from ordinary human civilization. It needs to feel cold, distant, mysterious, and perhaps almost impossible to understand. Iceland naturally provides landscapes that can achieve this effect. Black volcanic sand, rugged mountains, dark water, wide empty spaces, harsh weather, unusual geological formations. These characteristics create an environment that can appear almost otherworldly without requiring extensive digital manipulation. Black sand beaches. The black sand beaches were particularly important. Most audiences associate beaches with bright sand and warm colors. Iceland's volcanic beaches can look completely different. The dark sand creates a visual contrast with the sea and sky. That makes the landscape feel less like a normal human environment. For Hades, this is ideal. The underworld should not look like another Mediterranean beach. It should communicate separation from life. The darkness of the landscape can become symbolic. Odysseus is no longer simply traveling across the sea. He has crossed into a world associated with the dead. The landscape itself tells the audience that he has entered a different reality. Hades without a conventional fantasy set. One of the interesting aspects of this approach is that Nolan could create a supernatural environment without constructing a traditional fantasy set. There does not need to be an enormous digital palace. There does not need to be a glowing fantasy landscape. There does not need to be an obvious visual effect announcing, "This is the underworld." Instead, the environment can simply be physically strange. The audience recognizes something is wrong because the world feels different. That can be more unsettling. Real landscapes can sometimes appear more alien than computer-generated fantasy environments because they contain unpredictable geological structures that do not conform to ordinary expectations. Returning to Scotland. After Iceland, production returned to Scotland. Filming took place at Buckie Harbour along the Moray Firth coast. Another location was Sunnyside Beach near Cullen in Moray. These environments provided additional coastal imagery. The repeated movement between Scotland and other countries allowed the filmmakers to create the impression that Odysseus's journey spans an enormous geographical area. The audience does not necessarily need to know which country was used for which scene. The purpose is to make the world feel larger than any single location. Culbin Forest and the Lestrygonians. One of the most technically interesting sequences was filmed in Culbin Forest between July 3 and July 16. This sequence involved the Lestrygonians.